We might be a small island, but we've got an epic history. And there's a wealth of untold secrets still to uncover. So every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive, and sift to find clues.
Absolutely
Never seen anything
like it before.
It's just amazing.
In 2018, their discoveries have been more exciting than ever.
Look at that.
So that's from a tank then? That's brilliant. That's a nice find.
Not bad for day 2.
Not bad at all.
Each excavation has been filmed as it happened by the archaeologists themselves. Their dig diaries mean that we can be there for every exciting moment of discovery.
And you imagine him looking over his shoulder, trying to get away from the enemy aircraft through that.
I'll be in the lab where the teams will bring in their finds from pottery and metalwork to human remains, and we'll take a closer look to find out what these new digs can tell us about our ancestors. Look at that.
Be very careful.
I will be careful. Oh my goodness. While archaeologist Raksha Dave looks into the analysis that goes on long after a dig is finished.
Somebody stabbed her in the back of the head. What an awful way to go.
Welcome to Digging for Britain. In this programme, I'm joining archaeologists in the north of the country to share in their biggest discoveries.
Yes!
We go on a hunt for a lost Spitfire from the Second World War.
The instrument panel.
No!
Yeah? That is new star find.
And we follow the excavation of a recently identified Anglo-Saxon cemetery with some very unusual grave goods.
That's quite some bling.
I've come to the National Museum of Scotland to see how these discoveries are rewriting British history, and I've been given behind-the-scenes access to explore parts of the collections rarely seen by the public. I'll have the chance to get up close and personal with some of Britain's most intriguing treasures. Our first dig takes us to Dumfries and Galloway in southwest Scotland, and the Black Loch of Merton, where a perfectly preserved 2,500-year-old village is emerging from the mud. Moving back into prehistory, it is very rare to find actual evidence of the houses our ancestors lived in. Timber rots away, and very often all that we have left are imprints in the ground. But the amazing wetland preservation at Blackloch means that we have a chance to see what village life in Britain was really like 2,500 years ago. Back in 2016, Digging for Britain got privileged access as a team of archaeologists unearthed a remarkable lost village. From out of the mud, they revealed intriguing sections of wood that had been skillfully crafted into planks, and they were in incredible condition.
Wow, that's amazing. So this is the notch that's been cut to fit around the lower framework?
Yes!
All right.
Well done.
The finds were so spectacular that we're joining them again as they return to this prehistoric Pompeii for their 5th season. Archaeologists Anne Crone and Graham Cavers have been the site directors from the very beginning.
We've got lots of Iron Age sites throughout Scotland, but to have this level of preservation on a site of this date is very rare indeed, and I would say that it's probably a once-in-a-lifetime chance to excavate under these conditions.
Using the remains of the roundhouses dug up over the last 4 seasons, the archaeologists have built up a detailed picture of the village, and they discovered that these homes once sat on the peaty edge of a loch that had been drained in the 19th century. It's an extraordinary window into Iron Age life. But so far, they haven't found any personal possessions. And this year they're going to dig where they think they're most likely to find them: inside the houses. They soon make a remarkable discovery. An intact floor made of woven rushes and withies. This is ancient matting.
It looks like chipboard. It's so fresh. It's just layer upon layer of brush, sedges, reeds and things like this, which have just been compacted down.
The discovery of the matting gives us an incredible opportunity to glimpse the skills of our ancient ancestors and their efforts to insulate their homes and make them cosy in these inhospitable conditions. And now they've got a floor surface, there's a tantalising prospect that they may find personal items. They eventually make a breakthrough.
And what is it?
I have no idea. It looks like it's a piece of spindle-turned wood.
Anne has found an intriguing piece of clearly worked wood.
Oh, wow. Oh, has it got a hole? It's got a hole there.
Never seen anything
like it before.
That's amazing.
We're just removing the very sort of thick layer of laminated flooring materials. I was about to start pickaxing, and this is just lying on one of the surfaces within this house.
Discovering what this artefact is could give the team valuable insights into daily life at Blackloch. And then there's another extraordinary find in a rubbish pit located next to one of the houses.
Oh wow, I can see the decoration.
Extremely rare.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
My heart actually skipped a bit when I saw it.
This exquisitely decorated wooden object was found deep in the pit.
That's the rim here. So you've got two pieces and then one piece that goes this way. And then here is the rim on the other side.
Although squashed flat and in several pieces, the team knows what this is. It's a beautiful and rare lathe-turned wooden bowl.
Well, this has to be the star find of the entire 5 years of excavation so far.
The team's discoveries have given us an unprecedented new insight into the lives of the people who lived here at Blackloch. It's been an extraordinary dig. I've asked Anne Crone into the lab to discuss her findings. And this site is just amazing. I mean, that preservation that you're getting and being able to see not just how the houses were constructed, but starting to find some of the artefacts of everyday life as well.
Most of the time it's been the preservation of the structural remains, but that's really changed this year when we started finding wooden artefacts for the first time. So, yeah. I know.
I mean, it looks so modern. I still find it hard to believe that this is a prehistoric artefact, but you're quite sure about the date of it.
Oh, absolutely. It came out of very closely stratified deposits, and we have radiocarbon dated the deposit that it came from, and it's 2,500 years old.
That's just crazy.
Yeah. It's made of yew, which is a beautiful wood to carve. It's a spindle-turned object, so it's been sort of mounted with mandrels on either end there. It's very clearly designed for something, but I can only speculate as to what it is.
So these objects were just found in the floor. I mean, do you think that's just happened by accident?
No, I think these objects have been deliberately placed in the floor surfaces of this structure, possibly reflecting the function that the house has during its current phase. So perhaps if this is to do with weaving, that it was a weaving workshop during that phase.
And that's a beautiful bowl. So this is a turned bowl which has then been decorated.
Yeah. It's lathe turned. It's probably complete but flattened, and so what you're looking at is a reconstruction. It's an absolutely beautiful object. It seems to be unique in the UK at the moment. I've not heard of any other lathe-turned bowls. Its shape and the decoration, which is stunning, is really unusual. Never seen anything like that before. Until we found this, we didn't have very clear evidence for lathe turning in the Iron Age, but it's very clear from this bowl that not only were they doing it, but they've been doing it for a very long time, because this is so accomplished. Yes, so they're very good at it. And similarly with the baton as well.
How extraordinary to turn up those two objects, which, as you say, are utterly unique in Britain in one digging season. Yeah.
You wonder what, what else is out there. We're going to be able to look much more carefully at what's going on inside the houses, what sort of activities are taking place, and get closer to the people.
And how wonderfully close you got this year with that bowl and this, whatever it is, strange but very beautiful object.
Answers on a postcard, please.
Yeah, yeah. The dig at this very special Iron Age site allows us to see that our prehistoric ancestors were perhaps more technologically advanced than we've previously thought. Our next investigation takes us on the hunt for an RAF Spitfire lost on a World War II reconnaissance assignment. And it sheds light on a forgotten hero. On the 5th of March 1942, Flight Lieutenant Alistair Gunn took off from the RAF base at Wick in northeast Scotland. He was on a highly dangerous top-secret mission ordered by Winston Churchill, and it was a mission that he wouldn't return from alive. Gunn was tasked with monitoring the activity around the German battleship Tirpitz, which Hitler was using to intercept the Allied forces' merchant fleet. But only a few hours in, Alistair was shot down over the mountains near the Trondheim fjord in Norway. The Spitfire is arguably our most iconic fighter plane, famous, of course, for the role it played during the airborne conflict that was the Battle of Britain. But there is another side to the Spitfire's story. Reconnaissance Spitfires, like the one flown by Flight Lieutenant Alistair Gunn, played a vital role bringing key intelligence back to Britain. But these planes are now extremely rare. So finding this one would be a real coup. Nearly 80 years after it went down, aircraft engineer Tony Hoskins is driving all the way from Britain to Norway to lead the search.
It's the earliest model photo reconnaissance machine that was designed, so we know we're onto something really quite special here. So it is literally on the other side of that hill. I'm very excited.
With a team of historians, engineers and aviation enthusiasts, Tony hopes to find the exact spot where Gunn's plane crashed, bringing us close to the gritty realities faced by the RAF's brave reconnaissance pilots. It's a daunting task, and the team have only 3 days to find and recover the plane.
Anxious. Definitely anxious. It's 3 kilometres and about 1,000 metres climb, and of course we're coming back down with a significant amount of Spitfire.
Tony knows that Gunn's plane was shot down somewhere over these mountains, and he's narrowed down the location using German accounts and local reports to find the crash site.
I've just stood on a piece. There's more here, there's steel down there, it's just everywhere.
Luckily for the team, there's more wreckage than they'd ever hoped for.
This is the radiator door, and that's really lovely. Considering it's sat here for 76 years, that's in astonishingly good condition.
Suddenly, one of the team finds something that brings them even closer to Flight Lieutenant Gunn's final moments before he bailed out.
So this is a piece of the canopy, the perspex. So this was last looked through by Gunn, 5th of March 1942. And you imagine him looking over his shoulder, trying to get away from the enemy aircraft through that. Absolutely fantastic to find a bit of canopy.
Every piece that they salvage will help reveal how this particular Spitfire was stripped back and streamlined as a reconnaissance machine.
That's amazing.
Very good fun. Yeah, because that's almost the mount for its headrest. You can't get more in the cockpit than that.
Star item.
Because that is a brilliant piece.
With nearly 19 hours of daylight in Norway's summer months, Tony and his team could just keep digging, but they know they've got to leave enough time to carry the recovered pieces back down the mountain. The next morning, they're back.
This looks like the oxygen bottle.
1940 date on it.
These oxygen canisters allowed the reconnaissance pilots to fly higher than their fighter counterparts. The discovery of key reconnaissance items is a boost, but Tony soon realises that they need to widen the search area.
So we were hoping that a lot of it had gone bang into here, whereas it appears it's exploded and scattered over a wide area.
Although the team now have more ground to cover, the new search area pays dividends.
Shit.
There we go.
Well done.
Head on.
Instrument panel. Yeah. This is what they call the blind flying panel from the middle of the cockpit. This is the artificial horizon with its casing. So when you're flying in cloud, he would be able to know whether he's banking, climbing or descending.
That is new star find. Alistair Gunn's blind flying panel. Very careful. That's the aeroplane portion. And that, oh look.
Artificial horizon?
Artificial horizon. What do you want to find? Say something directly relates to him. The instrument panel.
And it's in one piece. Can't believe that. I really can't believe that. Amazing, isn't it?
They're clearly delighted to have found such a recognisable fragment, the instrument panel from Gunn's cockpit.
Well, thank you very much. We've had a fantastic day. We've managed to get about 2/3 of what we found today off, but we think the new areas that we found around are going to continue to give.
It's the final day of the dig and the team have only hours left. But what they want more than anything, what for them is the holy grail, is the reconnaissance camera.
Oi! Wow!
Wow, what's this?
Oi!
This is maybe some electrical coil, maybe?
Tony!
This is interesting.
Cameras could be here. The writing on the top says heater, front, lens, camera. 14 and 20-inch lenses. That's right, camera F24. So it carried 14-inch lens.
Could you find the film, please?
Yeah.
We'd like to get it developed.
Yeah, no problem.
Finding the camera mount takes the team right to the heart of Gunn's mission. The photos taken by reconnaissance Spitfires played a key role in the Allies' success. But of course the photos from this camera, as Gunn himself, never made it back. I've invited Tony Hoskins and colleague Mark Hillier into the lab to take a closer look at this strategically important plane and to uncover the story of its brave pilot. Tony, I think the first question to ask is, how on earth did you know where to start looking for this Spitfire?
Well, it was a long process. We had the combat report from the German who shot him down, so we knew a rough area to start looking in, and then thankfully local knowledge proved to be the way forward. Although it's not a big aeroplane when you compare it to a mountain, it's going to be all in the same kind of area. It ends up being a bigger area than we thought, but we came away with 70% of the aeroplane.
So what are we looking at here? Which part of the aircraft is this from?
So this section is from the wing. So this is a wing skin on the top, and what's interesting about this part is that you can see the PR blue. So all the photographic reconnaissance aircraft at that time were painted in this for camouflage. Yeah. And this is the roundel, so the identity markings that he carried on the aircraft, just so that you didn't get any friendly fire. So obviously that's really important in terms of identifying it as British, and the colour is right as well for a photographic reconnaissance Spitfire.
And would they have been blue all over then?
The same colour, top surface and underside, were all blue, exactly that. Yeah. Some of the photographic reconnaissance aircraft later on were painted pink.
Where were they pink?
Desert mostly, wasn't it? Yeah, and
for the sunrise in the morning and the dust in the sky. It comes pinky.
And it was stripped back in order to do this, was it?
That's right. I mean, they only built 220 of them, so it's a very rare item.
Yeah, they were unsung heroes if you think that they were often flying 4.5 hours, sometimes long sorties over water on their own, 30,000 feet, and unarmed. So obviously when they got to the target area, there's always the risk of enemy aircraft and being shot down, as Alistair found out to his cost.
Yeah. And you found not the camera itself, so this is a camera off another plane, presumably.
So it carried 3 cameras. It carried one that pointed out the side and 2 that pointed out the bottom. Yeah. And it was the very first setup for making 3D photographs, and that these would be mounted in a frame, and we've got the frame. That's the frame at the front.
So that is part
of... That's part of the frame that mounted the camera, yeah. So that frame would have looped around the top up here. Yeah. And then Alistair would have set it in on a dial for the height that he was clear of cloud and could see the target, and then the cameras would have motored to give 2 angles that would have focused at the ground at that point.
Just how important was photo reconnaissance at this time?
I think people underestimate the importance of it if you think this was the intelligence gathering arm of all the armed forces. And even the RAF today, you know, photographic reconnaissance is really key and massively important.
And then you've got this amazing insight into the cockpit that Alistair was sitting in, and this is the housing for his instruments.
Really important piece of the cockpit, and also the engine instruments around to the right. But just to think that he was in the cockpit, you know, in 1942, the last person looking at those instruments. This is part of the fuselage, and it's just from the cockpit section, just about where Alistair was sat, and the machine gun round has come through the cockpit, and this is the exit point from the side of the fuselage. It tells quite a grim story of the last few moments of his struggle to get away from the Germans. And then obviously, eventually, he lost that fight and had to bail out of the aircraft.
So he bails out, he parachutes, he survives this. What happens to him eventually?
He'd spent a night in a hut on the hill on the night of the 5th, and then, despite the help of the locals, he took the decision it was best to hand himself in. Eventually, he was sent to Staraglove 3, which was the camp made famous in the film The Great Escape.
Yeah.
And he got involved with the tunnelling committee and dug first one tunnel, which was discovered by the Germans, and then embarked on a second rather famous tunnel, which was the Tunnel Harry.
But did he make it out?
He did escape in the tunnel, but they got to within 25 kilometres of the port they were going to use to get to Sweden when he was discovered. He was writing letters home to his parents, and sadly his last letter he wrote was on the 19th of March, 44. Of course, he escaped on the night, the 24th, 25th, and the letter arrived at his parents' house on the 15th of May. But sadly, the next day, on the 16th of May, was the telegram from the War Office saying that he'd been executed.
That's just horrendous. I mean, he astonishingly brave.
They're often forgotten about, so this story is really important. Not just Alistair's, but all of the PRU pilots too. It's fantastic.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's not just about going and recovering pieces of metal from the side of a mountain. It's about recovering this story and remembering him. The discovery of this Spitfire by Tony and his team has graphically underlined just how risky these vital reconnaissance missions were. The fragments of Alistair Gunn's plane recovered from that Norwegian mountainside are a memorial to just one of World War II's forgotten heroes. Our next investigation takes us to the Roman fort of Vindolanda in Northumberland. Vindolanda is near Hadrian's Wall, the northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire. For almost 300 years, its numerous forts were key to the stability of military rule in this inhospitable and dangerous no-man's land. Roman sites are invariably rich in finds, but very few in Britain have delivered the sheer range of artefacts that we've found at Vindolanda, from swords to sandals and even handwritten notes from the soldiers themselves. Now, people have been digging at Vindolanda for decades, revealing the rich and layered history of the Romans in Britain. But can this year's dig uncover fresh insights about a particularly turbulent episode during those centuries of Roman rule? This summer, archaeologists have been digging into the ditches, Vindolanda's frontline defences, where the discoveries have been spectacular.
Look at that beauty.
And it's all down to the anaerobic conditions in this soil. Behind the scenes, post-excavation work is transforming our knowledge of one of the most turbulent times in the history of Vindolanda, the 2nd century Civil War. Archaeologist Raksha Dave is getting a privileged look at the conservation work taking place during this year's digging season.
Every archaeologist dreams of working on a site like Vindolanda. Each object that's uncovered is so precious that it makes their post-excavation labs like the emergency rooms of archaeology. Each object needs conservation immediately, or else its secrets could be lost forever.
I'm going to follow the process of conservation from start to finish. But while I wait for something to turn up in the trenches, I've met up with site director Andrew Burley to find out more about this year's mission.
Andrew, what are you actually concentrating on this year?
Well, we're focusing at the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century, when we have a Roman army in Britain trying to suppress rebels, but they're also fighting amongst themselves. In the ditches, we're getting evidence of things that are tossed away during that very brief but intense period of time. And it's a little sort of Vindolanda Pompeii, because it's only occupied for a few years, but everything is sealed, so it's giving us a lovely slice of life.
Back in the trenches, the digging team make a discovery in the 2nd century Antonine ditch. So Andrew and I head over to see what they found.
Oh, I can actually see it now. So I can see the
soul coming this way,
around.
bending around. That's it. There it is.
Yay!
Another Roman shoe at Vindolanda.
There was a bit of a shoe the other day, but this is the first complete one. Fantastic feeling. Thrown away by somebody 1900 years ago. Fabulous to find it.
Now the shoe is out of the ground, every second counts. So I'm taking it over to Barbara Burley in the Vindolanda Conservation Lab. She's going to show me what happens next.
Shall we open it up and have a look?
Yeah, I'm really excited to have a look at it, actually.
Probably a man's shoe by initial inspection. Wow, look at that. And you've even got the heel strengthener just here. Shall we get it washed up and have a look at it?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Barbara separates the very fragile shoe from its mud cocoon, using a soft brush and water.
So you do this process almost immediately?
We try to do it as fast as we can because they will continue to degrade until we put them into some sort of chemical bath, especially the organic objects like the leather.
Barbara has given me a Charles shoe to clean. I don't normally get a post-excavation opportunity, so I'm looking forward to this.
Am I using just cold water or can I use hot as well?
We don't want it to be too hot because that could actually kind of shock leather.
Right, okay.
Here it goes. The next step is to put them in these mesh bags that we've got. We use these bags in order to keep any sort of little bits that come off of it into the bucket here.
It is then preserved using a cocktail of chemicals, including acetone, which stabilises the leather. The whole process takes over 5 hours, but once completed, the shoe will be preserved for posterity and go on show in the museum with some of the other remarkable finds from the excavations. Back at the fort, I meet with Andrew to find out more about the recent shoe discoveries in the ditches.
So what do the shoes tell us about this particular period of conflict?
If we look at all of them together, and there's almost 1,000 of them now from this particular period, 45% are non-adult male shoes. In other words, they're children, they're women, they're teenagers, and that just changes the whole nature and the complexion of what was going on, what it was like to be part of this community.
It's really hard to imagine that those women and children would have seen exactly the same horrors as the men that were stationed here.
Some of the things they will have seen are horrendous. We have evidence here of people who've had their heads cut off and mounted on poles on the ramparts. And if you're a little child running around, that's the kind of thing that you're going to see.
The analysis of these shoes has given us a fresh understanding of the people who lived here at Vindolanda during those turbulent years. And it's given us a new take on the horrors endured by the inhabitants of this fort at the time.
Our next dig takes us to Scremby on the tip of the Lincolnshire Wolds, and a discovery which could fill in some gaps about what we know about Britain after the Romans left, a period sometimes known as the Dark Ages.
Around 1500 years ago, so history tells us, Britain was invaded by wave upon wave of Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and they transformed our country, giving us the English language and the basis of our laws. But actually, there is very little in the way of written records from the time. So if we want to understand Anglo-Saxon society and its cultural connections, we have to turn to archaeology. And this next excavation
gives us a chance to find out more. Last year, local landowner and metal detectorist Jim Hoff was exploring fields next to his home where he came across some rare and intriguing objects. A small team of archaeologists from the University of Sheffield started to investigate, and it wasn't long before they uncovered some graves dating to the late 5th, early 6th centuries, packed with jewellery and other precious goods. The discovery was so rich and so intriguing that this year they're returning for a full excavation led by Hugh Wilmot.
Here we are at Scremby, and let's go and look at the site. So one of the questions we've got here is, the people who are buried here, were they born here in Lincolnshire? Are they sort of second-generation migrants? Or perhaps their ancestors have always lived here and they've just adopted new styles and fashions of the incoming Anglo-Saxons? And these are all questions we can hopefully answer from the grave goods they've been buried with, but also some of the science we can do back in the lab.
Analysing the skeletons and the objects buried with them should provide insights into whether these people were British natives or immigrants. The team has stripped a large area and have already identified a number of graves in the ground.
Possibly there's the fill of another grave coming through here.
After last year's dig, they're expecting some great finds from the site, and they're not disappointed.
It's the second day, and we've just started excavating some of the graves. And here we've got one leg running down here, quite a large femur there, and lying right next to it here is a huge spearhead. And it dates to about 525 to about 550 AD, and this largest kind of spear you're going to see in the Anglo-Saxon world.
As the team targets some of the other graves, they are rewarded with even more exotic finds.
We have this pretty well-preserved skeleton of an adult female. Down at her hip, she's got the remains of an ivory bag ring, and this went round the mouth of a sort of fabric bag that would have hung from her hip. And inside it are all sorts of artefacts.
Ivory was a rare commodity in Anglo-Saxon Britain, but this isn't the first ring to be uncovered here.
We found one elephant ivory bag ring last year, and already, just over a week into the dig, we found two more. So what stage are we at with this one, Megan?
We're going to lift the copper brooch and this other tube bead,
Right.
and then the girdle hanger.
Oh, wow. I think that's the nicest one we've got so far.
After 1,500 years in the ground, the ring is extremely delicate.
Beautiful. Well done.
Good job, team.
And now lifted, it'll be sent to the lab for analysis.
So one of the things we can do, which is quite simple, is radiocarbon date the elephant ivory to see how old it is. Now, if it's sort of 6th century in date, it probably tells us it's coming from Africa. But if it ends up being sort of 10,000 BC, they must be reusing mammoth ivory, so that's quite an easy one to test out.
And pieces of exquisite jewellery are turning up in further female graves.
Now James has got a bead here, a very, very fine little amber bead.
Sources of amber are rare in Britain, but they're finding a surprising amount of this material here.
We've nearly finished excavating this burial here, and it has a young lady in it, and on her forearm is the skeleton of a baby. Placed upon both the mother and the baby were a large quantity of beads. So far we've got nearly 500 of them. It's really quite extraordinary.
Many of these female skeletons are buried with elaborate bead necklaces.
That's quite some bling.
It's been a successful excavation, and with so many intriguing discoveries, what can the archaeologists tell us about these people and their bling? I've asked Hugh Wilmot into the lab to give me some answers. Hugh, this is an astonishing site, and it is completely new. Nobody knew it was there.
Oh, absolutely. There hasn't been a cemetery in this location recorded before. At first we thought it's just going to be a standard sort of Saxon cemetery, but actually it's turned out to be rather more interesting.
And just extraordinary finds.
Amazing.
You've brought some of them in here together with one of the skeletons. Are these finds that were actually found associated with this skeleton?
Yes, these are some, not all the finds that were found with this skeleton, but here are some of the sort of the more diagnostic ones and some of the large ones.
They seem to be very richly furnished graves.
They're extremely richly furnished. Of the 24 graves we excavated, only one had no artefacts in, which is a very unusual proportion.
So she would have been placed in the grave fully clothed then with all her...
Oh, yes, absolutely.
With all her accessories. What's that? It looks like a little buckle.
Well, these are where the finds start getting a bit more special.
Yeah.
It's a very unusual design that you don't normally find in Lincolnshire.
Where do you normally find it, then?
Well, not many buckles like this have been found, but where they have been, they've been found in Kent or on the south coast of England.
Oh, really? So, yeah, quite some way away.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is that one of the amber beads?
It is. It's a small bead. They're quite simple, quite plain, but this is just one example of them, of which we had hundreds.
I mean, there seem to be extraordinary numbers in each grave, or at least some of the graves were just full of these beads.
Absolutely. It's clearly one of their sort of biggest fashion statements, these necklaces, and certainly the most visible thing.
And do we know where this amber has come from? Because obviously that's not local.
We do. 20 years ago, all these techniques for provenancing the amber, looking at the sort of ivory, you know, we couldn't do that, so you had to speculate. But now we can actually put some hard answers to some of these questions. And this comes from the Baltic, which is perhaps not unsurprising, because we know that the Baltic is a major supplier of amber.
And now, what about that ivory? Is that likely to have come along a similar reach, then, from Northern Europe into Northern Asia?
Well, that's an interesting question, because in the past, people have speculated that perhaps, because you've got an amber trade coming from the Baltic, that perhaps ivory was coming in the form of mammoth ivory from Siberia, where it's preserved in the permafrost, and perhaps the same trade routes are bringing that ivory. But we've done radiocarbon dating on this ivory, and it's clearly contemporary to the Anglo-Saxon cemetery, so it must be an elephant.
Yeah, because mammoths weren't there at this time.
They've been extinct for 10,000 years. So, you know, this has come from either Africa or maybe even India.
And what about the individuals themselves? Because you can provenance the amber and the ivory. There's a chance of provenancing these individuals. So do you have any results from that yet?
We do, and that's what's so exciting. Previously, we've kind of speculated where these people may have come from, whether they're perhaps, you know, locals who have adopted new fashions, or have they actually migrated from, you know, northern Germany, from Denmark. And we've done isotope analysis on this individual, and we came up with quite a surprising result. They're not from Lincolnshire, but they're not from further afield in terms of across the North Sea. This individual grew up on the south coast, Kent, perhaps around as far as Brighton, that kind of a region.
Really?
Yeah. So
I mean, isn't it extraordinary to have that level of biography of somebody?
Absolutely.
That you know that as a young girl she was living down in the southeast, and then she moved northwards and ended up in Lincolnshire.
Yeah.
For me, this is where she came from. She's wearing things still, which hark back to her childhood in Kent.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's a memory that lingers.
Yeah. This new discovery at Scremby is revealing some wonderful detail of life in the Dark Ages, and it's allowing us to delve deeper into the cultural connections of our Anglo-Saxon ancestors across the British Isles and beyond. Our next dig diary takes us to the furthest reaches of northern Scotland and the remote island of Rousey in Orkney. The islands of Orkney are home to an abundance of well-preserved archaeology, and Rousey is no exception, having been nicknamed the Egypt of the North. But its sites are often troubled by more than their fair share of bad weather, with aggressive tides causing erosion along the coastline. But sometimes with destruction comes discovery. In 2010, winter storms revealed a line of stones on a beach, and archaeologists realised that they could be looking at the first signs of an ancient monument dating right back to Britain's earliest civilization, perhaps even a new jewel in Orkney's crown. This summer, the team is back on site for their 8th season, and they're led by Steve Dockrell and Julie Bond from the University of Bradford. Orkney is peppered with incredible prehistoric sites, and the team already believe that they've found something very special here on Rousey, a Neolithic tomb dating back more than 4,000 years. Photos taken just a few years ago show the circular walls of the monument.
The way they built
these tombs was to build up concentric walls of stone. So you end up with a kind of a big mound, and over the years you end up with something like a green hill.
But these rings have now been reduced to rubble. Much of the monument has already been destroyed by the sea.
It's heartbreaking that we're watching this thing disappear, but it gives us an opportunity to excavate and to pick this apart and to really understand how these were built.
This golden opportunity should provide invaluable clues into the monument's construction and use over time before it is lost to the waves forever.
Well, this is the second day of uncovering the chambered tomb. We're a little bit worried as to how much is still left. Although this passage is still here, it looks from the angle as if some of the lower parts might have disappeared.
Once they've removed the protecting stones laid over the site, the team are down to the well-built walls of the tomb.
The wall goes off down onto the beach, curves around in a huge arc and comes back again. This seems to be the doorway.
And as they dig through into the passageway, the archaeologists uncover some tantalising clues as to the tomb's internal construction.
My Lord! Wow, look at that! That's huge! As they've gone back into this area here, enormous great stones have appeared, and they are absolutely massive. We're talking about something before they broke that would be about this wide. So that's got to be roof of something, a lintel from something, which is really interesting.
These huge slabs would have spanned the width of the passageway, and they remind us that our Neolithic ancestors were skilled engineers. The team wants to locate the central area of the tomb, so this year they've been given an opportunity to move further landward. But it's already thrown them a monumental curveball. As the team excavate down through the mound's central top layers, they come across evidence that just doesn't add up. Someone seems to have made this tomb into a home.
Well, this is the surprise this year. This is the thing we didn't quite expect. It looks like we've got an Iron Age house right in the top of the tomb. You can see there's a series of upright stones going round in an arc, and then there's another wall, quite a big wall, coming round this way as well.
This new evidence suggests that the Neolithic tomb, which housed the dead over 4,000 years ago, then became a home to the living 2,000 years later. The new circular feature indicates that this is an Iron Age roundhouse constructed deep into the central parts of the monument. The insertion of this younger building into the original structure is a revelation for the archaeologists, who now believe that this wasn't the only new build in the area. In another trench, just yards from the tomb's entranceway, the tomb have uncovered yet another stone-built structure, and it has a surprising array of features.
Look at it. Yes!
This is architecturally very characteristic of a Pictish building which is roughly 500 to 900 AD. We've got a staircase that leads down and into the building. We've got a central hearth, but crucially around it as well, we've got really black layers filled with charcoal and other material, and 2 anvil stones set next to the hearth.
Remarkably, what the archaeologists have discovered is a Scottish Iron Age or Pictish blacksmith's workshop over 1,000 years old. And as they dig the final layers, they uncover evidence of early and extremely rare industrial activity, including copper working.
We would expect all settlement sites to have evidence of blacksmithing, but to find a building that is a dedicated coppersmith's workshop is exceptional. We would normally only expect to find such a site in very, very high status sites and in larger urban settlements.
As the team records the final sections of the smithy, they get one more surprise. There are greasy finger stains on one of the anvil stones, an incredible link straight back to the blacksmith who worked in this building over 1,000 years ago. I've asked Julie Bond and Steve Dockrell into the lab to tell me more about this extraordinary place.
This is such an incredibly complicated site.
We have dug sites in the Northern Isles before, so we knew they were complex, but this is an order above, I think.
What is amazing about this site is that it was a real hotbed of activity.
I think it must have been a very busy place, and the archaeology there is quite remarkable. We get settlement build up for these long periods of time.
And what about the reuse of this Neolithic tomb? It seems very odd that Iron Age people should come along and just want to build their houses into the side of it.
It may be because it's a ready source of dressed stone. It may also be something to do with identity and ownership of that part of the landscape.
Maybe they have an interest in what's gone before.
That it's not just about using the stone,
No.
that they're close to the ancestors, perhaps?
Close to the ancestors.
And then you've got evidence of metalwork.
This is probably part of the tuyere, which is basically usually a piece of stone or a block of clay that you put the bellows through. It's to protect the bellows from catching fire.
Right.
So that you can pump air into your hearth to get the temperature up high.
Yeah.
So we actually know where the smith was sitting and where the person working the bellows, was sitting in that little building.
Yeah, yeah.
See how they've lived their lives in those places, which
and
is...
see where people have kneeled.
Yes.
I mean,
That's right.
I was amazed by that.
Yes,
that must be a
it's
very
absolutely
rare
fantastic,
find
isn't it?
indeed.
I mean, you can see those fingerprints there, and you can see these carbon splodges where we think the smith would have been kneeling up against it.
Yeah.
This is a beech cobble that's been used as a hammerstone, and they're incredibly strong. So they make ideal anvils.
Yeah.
And we only found these finger marks when we cleaned it. It was totally invisible when we were excavating it.
How have they survived?
It would have been dark, the metal would have been glowing, it would have been hot, smoky, lots of carbon, lots of sweat.
So kind of grease and soot together, staining the stone.
I don't think I've ever had quite such a vivid understanding of how somebody used a building.
We can actually piece together exactly how people operated. So that's quite an unusual thing for archaeology, to be able to place people into it.
The sort of place that people coming to Orkney would have heard about, would have known about.
Would have known about.
It was a highway. It was a gateway to the Atlantic going out.
Go that way and that's all you have in front of you, is the Atlantic. Turn left and you're heading towards the rest of Scotland and down through the islands towards Ireland. Turn right.
You're heading to Scandinavia.
Yeah.
And of course that was so important in the Viking period.
This gateway works both ways because the Vikings we know were certainly settled nearby, possibly on this site, because first generation Vikings were buried close to this site. And so it's a bit of a temptation, isn't it, if you're sailing past this wonderful site with the, with its own coppersmith and all these indications of wealth, and you're a Viking in a longship. Are you going to leave that alone?
These new discoveries on Rousey show that, far from being a remote group of islands, Orkney was a vibrant and busy hub which was occupied by wave after wave of people for thousands of years through prehistory. At the National Museum of Scotland, they have further evidence of this activity.
The collection centre houses some 12 million objects, and amongst them is an artefact that speaks of the enduring importance of Orkney, sitting right at the centre of a maritime network that continues into the Viking period.
The Westness brooch was found in 1963 in a Viking burial not far from the Neolithic tomb on Rousey. I've met with early medieval expert Dr. Adrian Maldonado, who's going to tell me more about this exquisite object.
So, Adrian, these objects all come from the same grave, and usually I'd be fascinated in these beautiful brooches, but they're slightly eclipsed by this amazing object.
Not only is this the best example of a brooch pin of its kind, the entire grave is the richest female Viking burial in Scotland. The technology of filigree, that sort of dotting of gold into beaded wire, that's something that we're getting from Anglo-Saxon metalwork at this time that is then adopted into Irish and Scottish metalworking. Here you can see the head of a kind of beaked creature, and then you have this amazing sort of wolf head, a sort of ferocious creature.
Yeah. Do we know anything else about her? Do we know where she came from? I mean, did she live in Orkney, or was she from elsewhere?
Now, this is an interesting thing. One of the things that they've been able to do is test the teeth of the females in the West Ness Cemetery to see whether they were local or not. And what's come out of this is that they're not from Orkney, but they're from somewhere in the British Isles, either from Eastern Britain, Lowland Britain, or Lowland Ireland.
So they're not local then?
People from outside Orkney are settling in Orkney at that time.
Yeah.
They're creating new settlements and sometimes sort of continuing older ones.
So Orkney was a great place to be. It was right at the centre of this Viking world.
Absolutely. If you're involved in long-distance sea trade, Orkney's where you want to be.
Discoveries like this from the Viking Age shows how archaeology can change the story of Britain and revise our understanding of life in the past. Our final dig takes us to the city of Salford, where archaeologists are delving into the heartland of Britain's Industrial Revolution to uncover the largest jail in Georgian England. The site of New Bailey Prison sits on the edge of the River Irwell, in an area linked to the heavy industrialisation of Salford, which began over 200 years ago. As Salford's industry boomed, its population expanded and crime increased. At its zenith, New Bailey Prison was the largest in the country, and it could hold 750 prisoners. Now, an excavation provides an unprecedented opportunity to find out what the lives of those prisoners were like during the Industrial Revolution. As part of a major regeneration of Salford, archaeologists are getting a chance to scrape back the centuries and reveal evidence of a radical new approach to crime and punishment. On site are a team from the University of Salford, headed by Rachel Reeder and Mike Novell. They are currently in their 5th and final year, and Digging for Britain has been following them all the way. The dig is focusing on the later 1820s extension of the prison, and preservation is looking good.
What we are seeing is how these buildings were actually built. The foundations are surviving 2, even 3 metres deep in places, which is brilliant.
And better yet is that these new discoveries aren't even documented on the plans.
All of this is below ground, so we certainly had no idea that this was here. We're finding those little bit of extras that kind of help tell the story about this site.
Further exploration of the foundations has uncovered hints that the prisoners may have been allowed some surprising creature comforts.
Oh, blimey. There it is. So we found what looks like the remnants of a heating system, which is very unusual, completely unexpected, not on the maps.
And Andy thinks he's discovered where the main boiler was positioned.
You have a staircase. So the stairs came down here. There's your access to your boiler house. This is probably part of the fire pit underneath the actual boiler itself. The heat would have gone up. There would have been flues going into the other cells.
And there's coke. It's a great indication what they're actually doing in there. Just further evidence that we've definitely got a heating system here.
And heating isn't what you'd expect to find in a prison of this age.
We know the really poorest working classes actually were being better fed and better looked after in this prison than they would be out in the industrialised slums in the 1840s.
But despite being heated, some of the cells became increasingly cramped.
This is probably no more than 2 by 2 metres. More than one person would have had to have slept in here, possibly up to 3 people at one point.
As the local population expanded and crime increased, the number of prisoners eventually became overwhelming.
Ultimately,
The prison has far more people in it than it was originally designed for. This was recognised in the 1860s as being unworkable.
Hemmed in by urban developments, the prison couldn't expand, and it finally closed in 1868, making way for the larger prisons of an even more brutal Victorian age. I've asked Rachel Reeder and Mike Neville into the lab to discuss their discoveries and find out more about prison life at New Bailey during the Industrial Revolution.
This is an incredible opportunity to excavate a prison which starts in the Georgian period and goes all the way through into the Victorian period.
The prison was built at a time of improvement and enlightenment. This is a new type of prison building. It's one of the first of its type in the UK.
And you discovered quite a lot that isn't on the plans. What was the most surprising thing about it to you?
I think the discovery of a heating system in the cells, which was completely unexpected, not on the plans.
And that's part of the flue, is it?
It absolutely is, yeah. So there were several of these kind of built up into a wall, and it would have basically directed the hot air from this boiler to the cells. How effective it was, we don't actually know, but we've got it, which was fantastic.
And in terms of what life was like for the prisoners, it can't have all been a bed of roses, surely, living in a prison like that?
It's not designed to be a bed of roses.
No, absolutely not. I mean, we know from the records that some of those that were sentenced to hard labour had to work on the treadmill, and we know that they were climbing around 20,000 feet a day. That's 2/3 the height of Everest. And now, initially, it was actually connected to a mill that kind of ground up wood for dye, which was kind of then passed out and sold to the local mills. But then it was disconnected eventually, so we know that they were climbing on that for absolutely no purpose whatsoever.
And what about the population in the prison? Who would have been there? What kind of cross-section of society?
We would have had men, women, we would have even had children in here. I think the records show that the youngest children we would have had would have been about 9, 10 years old.
Well, you have to remember that these are minor offenders. They're not mass murderers, they're not people who've committed a serious crime. It's petty theft, it's brawling in the streets, it's vagrancy. Now that means they're from the poorest part of the working population of Salford and Manchester. And we do have some comments from women bursting into tears when they are about to be released from the prison because they're faced with going back to those kind of slum conditions.
Yeah, and your excavations have shown that at least they were in a place which was, heated during the winter.
This fascinating excavation has allowed us to go beyond the written record, uncovering a revolutionary and more human approach to the criminal system in the 18th century that's often hidden from view. From uncovering a lost World War II plane and the tragic story of its brave pilot, to glimpsing an incredibly well-preserved Iron Age village occupied over 2,500 years ago, we've been able to reach back through the centuries and touch the lives of our ancestors. We might be a small island, but we've got an epic history. And there's a wealth of untold secrets still to uncover. So every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive, and sift to find clues.
Absolutely
Never seen anything
like it before. It's amazing.
In 2018, their discoveries have been more exciting than ever.
Look at that.
So that's from a tank then? That's brilliant. That's a nice find.
Not bad for day 2. Not bad at all.
Each excavation has been filmed as it happened by the archaeologists themselves. Their dig diaries mean that we can be there for every exciting moment of discovery.
And you imagine him looking over his shoulder, trying to get away from the enemy aircraft through that.
I'll be in the lab where the teams will bring in their finds from pottery and metalwork to human remains, and we'll take a closer look to find out what these new digs can tell us about our ancestors.
Look at that.
Be very careful.
I will be careful. Oh my goodness.
While archaeologist Raksha Dave looks into the analysis that goes on long after a dig is finished.
Somebody stabbed her in the back of the head. What an awful way to go.
Welcome to Digging for Britain. In this programme, I'm joining archaeologists in the west of the country to share their biggest discoveries. At Silchester, we investigate a monumental bathhouse, revealing how the Romans first stamped their mark on Britain.
The preservation of the blocks and the bricks is absolutely superb.
In Bath, construction work beneath the magnificent medieval abbey takes us on an incredible journey through the city's multi-layered hidden past.
This is probably late 13th and 14th century. Quite incredible that this has survived.
And near Winchester, a team unlocked the secrets of a vast 18th century military camp occupied by a horde of German mercenaries.
There's gold leaf on it. It's really, really shiny. It's not the sort of thing you expect in a military field kitchen.
No, not at all.
And at the Museum of Somerset in Taunton, I'll discover how objects here help us tell the story of the West. Our first dig takes us off the coast of Portsmouth to a major underwater investigation into an 18th century ship that revolutionised the Royal Navy.
There are around 40,000 ships wrecked around the British coastline, but the chance to excavate one is incredibly rare. It is monumentally expensive and usually only happens when the ship is of national importance and under threat of destruction. Now, both are true for HMS Invincible, and this is the largest underwater excavation since the Mary Rose.
For centuries, our nation's power lay in our maritime might. But at the start of the 18th century, Britain's navy was in danger of losing its edge. Then, in 1747, the Royal Navy captured the French ship L'Invincible, a cutting-edge, streamlined 74-gun ship that could literally blow anything out of the water. Renamed HMS Invincible, it became the flagship of the British Navy until it ran aground on the 19th of February, 1758.
The wreck of the Invincible provides us with an unprecedented opportunity to discover how the 18th century Navy was being revolutionised. And now that shifting sands are putting the wreck under threat, no expense is being spared to recover as much as possible.
A combined team from Bournemouth University, the Maritime Archaeology Trust and the National Museum of the Royal Navy is carrying out this £2 million project to salvage the remains of the wreck. And halfway through the 3-year project, the clock is ticking to retrieve what evidence is left.
It's all about trying to recover as much as we can, record it as quickly as we can, because during the winter we have high energy storm events, and this is exposing vulnerable and fragile artefacts as well as the ship structure.
The maritime archaeologists rely on huge suction tubes to suck up the sand and blow it away from the site. They're constantly battling the threatening tides. But on day one, precious artefacts begin to surface. One of the first things to come up, a fully intact gunpowder barrel.
There would have been over 300 barrels of gunpowder on board.
That's the gunpowder. And actually you see underwater when they're moving it, you just get clouds of black. It is a pretty bad smell. So that's the sulfur.
It's a great start, indicating that some of the key armaments are still on board. And with their expert eyes scouring the wreck, the divers are soon rewarded with even more gun accessories.
These coins here, coins were used for supporting the breech end of the guns, clearly labelled with the gun type. So here we have the 9-pounder coin, and next to it, the much larger 32-pounder coin. Everything's labelled. So when you've got the chaos of battle going on, they know exactly where to go to get the 32-pounder coin, the 9-pounder.
With every new discovery, the archaeologists are revealing why Invincible was such a formidable ship. And it wasn't just her superlative firepower.
We're learning where they stored things, how they stored things. It shows the organisation, the professionalism, the discipline.
As the season nears its end, the archaeologists suddenly make their most exciting discovery yet. Guns. The Invincible bristled with an amazing 74 cannons, but until now the team had thought that many of these had been recovered when the ship was wrecked.
But what's really important about this is an unexpected find. We assumed that all of the guns that weren't jettisoned were recovered from the Invincible, so it's great that we found these.
These guns are a rare and important discovery, and I've invited site directors Dan and Dave into the studio to discuss the team's finds and what they've learned about the ship that revolutionised our Navy. Dan, looking at you excavating this ship, it looks as though it's incredibly shallow.
It is. The site is only in 8 to 9 metres of water.
And being that shallow, presumably as soon as you do get a storm, it's hugely at risk because the energy of the waves will be transmitted down.
Exactly.
Then material becomes exposed. You can see from the 2 blocks at the end there, they were identical when made and they both ended up in the water at the same time. But one is still perfect and that was buried within the wreck. But once things are exposed, they're a food source for marine life and they just disappear.
And is this one of the smaller guns that came up?
Yes, this is called a swivel gun. It's an anti-personnel weapon. So it's when you come close to the enemy, when you're side by side. And we found them low down on the ship. So they weren't in use at the time. So we're learning something new, that they stored these weapons and were only going to bring them out when they needed them, when they were at close quarters with the enemy. And we weren't expecting to find these. So it was a really nice addition to the finds.
And I think one of the most overwhelming things is the smell. Is that the rope that we can smell?
That is the rope. It kind of takes you back in time.
Yeah.
This is a smell that hasn't changed since 1758. And this is exactly what the sailors would have smelt. It's that tar, it's the pitch.
Tarry, yeah. And it still smells 250 years later.
I know, I really love it. It enables us as archaeologists to really sense what it was like on board the ship.
Yeah.
And we found out that it's actually junk. So it wasn't going to be used in the rigging. It was going to be used in the making of these objects, which are known as gun wads.
So the old rope that's in the bottom of the ship is there to be picked apart and made into these wads?
That's it. So it's for the process of loading and firing the guns. You would load the cannons, ramming down your powder charge with this. This is a rammer head. You would then ram down one of those wads to kind of seal the charge. You would then ram down the shot. And to stop that shot rolling back out the barrel of the gun, you would have to ram down another wad.
Yeah.
So they're essential.
And what about these pieces of wood here with marks on? What are they?
And these are tally sticks that went with these wads to show which size of gun they would be used for. So in Roman numerals, we have 32 for the 32-pounder.
And 24.
And 24 for the 24-pounder. So this shows the organisation on board.
And what have you got in that box?
Well, what I've got here is a small timer.
Look at that.
It's used for calculating the speed of the vessel.
Dave, is that glass?
That's glass.
And it's intact?
It's intact, as it was when the ship sank, and it was found on the shelf it was placed on when it was last used.
Can I hold it?
You can, but be very careful.
I will be careful.
OK.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's a 28-second timer, because you run a length of rope over the stern of the vessel with knots in every 47 feet.
Yeah.
And after 28 seconds, the number of knots that have run through your hands are the speed of the vessel.
Yeah, yeah.
So they had 28 seconds. That's what, that's where knots comes from, that's right.
I just cannot believe that this has survived intact 250 years on the seabed, and it's made of wood and glass, and there it is, it's perfect. And I'm really nervous about holding it, so I'm going to hand it back to you,
Should we put it back?
Okay, oh, my goodness. So what we've got here is an astonishing demonstration of the level of organisation that was going on in the Navy by the 18th century.
That's it. We have the evidence for a well-organised, disciplined Navy, which is a complete contrast to the previous century, where they're a lot more dysfunctional. There's been catastrophic disasters due to a lack of discipline and organisation on board.
This ambitious dig has revealed exactly why HMS Invincible became the model for future cutting-edge ship design in the British Navy, and why in the century that followed, Britain could boast that it ruled the waves. We stay in the 18th century next as we head to Barton Farm near Winchester, to a dig that gives us a rare insight into an unusual, forgotten moment in Britain's military past. Archaeologists were called in to evaluate this site before a new housing development got started, because historical plans recorded that a vast military encampment had stood here in the 18th century, housing 9,000 German soldiers. These were not prisoners of war, nor an invading force that has somehow slipped under the historical radar. These troops were invited here. In 1756, King George II, of German descent himself, invited an army from Hesse in Germany over to keep Britain safe and to wage wars against its enemies. This is the first opportunity to get a really detailed insight into what life was like in the Hessian camp, and also perhaps a clue as to what made them such a formidable fighting force. A team from Pre-Construct Archaeology is carrying out the dig into this unique German camp, joined by MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood and his team of ex-soldiers turned archaeologists.
This is where the Hessians were based in 1756. They were here for 10 months in what was a pretty cold and miserable winter. And to get themselves shelter, they dug down into the solid chalk. They provided themselves with dugouts, with field kitchens, in quite a regular pattern.
The team have a contemporary plan of the camp. However, they don't know how accurate it is or what the internal structures were really like. But once they start digging, the outlines of the camp are clearly visible in the hard chalk, and it seems to be even more massive and highly regimented than they'd thought.
These square features are the footprints of field kitchens, and the camp extended for a distance of some 1 kilometre from roughly where we're speaking, right over in the far distance towards the houses over there.
The whole camp is far too big to dig in its entirety, and the team are only focusing on the field kitchens and the dugouts affected by the housing development. They hope that this will tell them how both were constructed and what living conditions might have been like, and they quickly find their first clues.
So it looks like we've got the neck of a bottle here.
Oh, cool.
The glassware's very similar to wine bottles.
As digging continues, the team finds further tantalising clues about life in the German soldiers' camp.
We are finding loads and loads of oyster shells. We've also got clay pipes. Now, it's quite tempting to think of these Hessians actually sitting around eating oysters, which were much more commonplace as a food substance in those days, and smoking away.
The finds are painting a picture of how the Hessian troops whiled away the hours waiting for action. And although this is essentially temporary accommodation, the dugouts are well built and would have been surprisingly comfortable.
The really lovely thing about this is this chimney. It's a remarkable feature. You've got a series of mortared bricks in place, and then you've got a mortared area up here which forms the flue of the chimney, and this must have been a real godsend. Absolutely critical, from having spoken to the soldiers on the site, is keeping yourself warm in the dugouts. The other thing we've got in this area is a series of stake holes cut into the chalk, and those represent where timber uprights were put in place. They would have enabled the roof structure, probably like a tent, to go over the top.
The preservation of the dugouts is creating a remarkably clear picture. These were solidly built, heated structures, roofed over with canvas. Quite cosy then, but also cramped, as up to 50 men could have been living in each one. As well as the dugouts, the other main features on site are a string of field kitchens that catered for the 9,000-strong horde of soldiers, and they're producing some equally interesting finds.
What have you got, Rob?
So it's a mid-18th century pot, red glazed pot.
And this is in one of the little ovens cut into the Hessian field kitchen.
Hessian cookhouses.
That's super cool. So what have you found?
Well, I've got a little pin, which is beautifully preserved, and also just found a little button.
I mean, that'll clean up beautifully, won't it? It's still got really nice decoration on it, but it's also got gold leaf on it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's really, really shiny. It's not something you expect in a military field kitchen.
No, not at all.
This is such an intriguing and unusual site. I've invited Richard and site director Paul into the lab to find out more.
I think sites like this are great. We've got a very clear idea of what's there from this map, but actually still it's quite difficult to imagine how this plays out on the ground and, you know, the organisation of it. So to have this opportunity is fantastic.
Yeah, to know the actual structural form of these dugouts and the kitchens and the sorts of elements that they indicate about the lives of the people that were here in 1756, you can get a certain amount from this, but you've got to do the digging to find out.
Because looking at this, it just looks like a tented camp, doesn't it? You're not really given that idea that it's
like a
much
kind
more
of Glastonbury
permanent.
or something, doesn't
yeah,
it? And,
yeah.
very
well,
different.
slightly regimented Glastonbury.
Exactly, what you probably better lose.
And Richard, you're there digging with soldiers who were in Operation Nightingale. Were they impressed?
A real envy that they
Yeah.
had such nice features in the 1750s compared to what they call shell scrapes nowadays and just little gouges into the ground, where these things were beautifully constructed.
With staircases and fireplaces, and
Yeah,
sometimes some of them with ledges to sit on, perhaps. And
Well, cut-ups for candles in some places. They're quite ornate in many ways, and it's perhaps surprising when you think of the conditions of the time that they have put so much effort into building these structures.
And that button we saw coming up in the trench, didn't we?
Yeah, that's the one from one of the field kitchens, and so you see the shiny gilding on it.
Yeah, they're quite ornate for soldiers, aren't they?
They don't look military, do they? They don't look martial. We're tempted to think that you see the little schematic illustrations in the plan of these locals coming out to look at the Hessians, because they must have been a real curiosity for folks from Winchester.
That's what these people in the
coming out
carriages
to
are
look.
doing.
And it's tempting to think that that sort of ornate button just might be dropped from one of these people who come to see their allies in the field in Winchester.
And you recovered quite a few finds, giving us a bit of an insight into the day-to-day lives of these soldiers.
Yes, soldiers spend a lot of time waiting for things to happen, don't they? And you imagine that they spent a lot of time sort of eating and smoking and drinking day after day, month after month. And here we have a very nice example of an enamelled glass schnapps bottle that presumably one of the members of the army actually brought with him, you know, with his own supply of special spirits, perhaps.
Yeah. So they're enjoying a bit of local beer and German schnapps in their dugouts. I think what's particularly interesting is that when you think of an efficient army, very often we focus on, you know, what they're doing in battle, tactics, all of that sort of thing. But actually, this is equally important, if actually not more important, how you keep troops well-fed, comfortable, in good fighting form when you're not actually on the front line.
Yeah, without decent logistics and morale, you're not going to succeed, and so that's a crucial part of this story for sure.
Yeah. The dig has given us a unique insight into a forgotten moment in our military history. The order and sophistication of the camp revealing why the Hessians were such crack troops and were invited over by George II. And here, at the museum in Somerset, a rather personal item belonging to the king himself provides another insight into George's military campaigns and his connections with Germany. Tom, tell me about these trousers then, or in fact, they're not really trousers, are they?
Well, I think we need to call them breeches. That's what they would have been called at the time. They're remarkable because they belong to no less a person than George II, King of England for 33 years, from 1727 to 1760. And more remarkably, he wore them at the Battle of Dettingen in Germany, and it was the very last time an English monarch led his troops into battle.
Quite an extraordinary item to be wearing and incredibly colourful. I mean, you know, he was not going for camouflage here.
No, he wanted to be a visible symbol of monarchy and of leadership, and he was renowned as being a very brave sovereign.
So he would have cut a fine and very noticeable figure wearing these bright red breeches, and
He
they've
would.
got gorgeous gold buttons as well.
They have, yes. The buttons are a very fine embellishment.
They're very beautiful. The material is slightly felty to the touch.
Yes.
Beautifully fine stitching. And I've noticed that the pockets are made of incredibly fine leather. So I've heard of kid gloves, but here are kid pockets.
Kid pockets, yes.
Yeah.
They're of the very highest quality, and as I suppose you'd expect for the King of England and the Elector of Hanover, he didn't settle for second best, even when he was on the battlefield.
So was George still, at this point, a ruler of Hanover?
Yes, he was. Throughout his life, he had two roles, as Elector of Hanover and as King of England.
But those Hanoverian connections surely explain why he later brings over the troops, the Hessian troops.
When he arrived in England in 1727, he found an army which was under strength and not at all experienced. And Hessian troops were really the means by which he strengthened the British Army and made it fit for battle in European campaigns.
So how did the breeches end up here in the Museum of Somerset?
Well, they were purchased in 1982 as part of a job lot of costume, so that it's partly an accident, but it's a happy accident because some of the troops who fought at Dettingen were the 13th Regiment of Foot, who became the Somerset Light Infantry.
So there is a Somerset connection, and Somerset men would have seen George II riding into battle in these resplendent breeches.
They would, and it's very good that they've survived, and rather remarkable that they have.
Yeah. Our next investigation takes us to Salisbury and into the labs of Wessex archaeology, where experts are analysing over 100 skeletons from a recently unearthed 19th century pauper's graveyard. In 2016, Wessex Archaeology began working alongside developers who were about to build on the disused new Covent Garden Flower Market site in Battersea, London. 150 years ago, a graveyard occupied this site, but everyone thought that it had been fully removed in the 1960s. So the team was surprised to find that a 100-metre strip at the edge of the cemetery still remained. In the 19th century, this was where the poorest would have been buried, so it's an exciting discovery. These skeletons have to be exhumed, ready for reburial, but this gives us a precious opportunity to look at life and death for some of the poorest people in 19th century Britain, just as cities were becoming utterly transformed by industrialisation. To find out what the post-excavation work can tell us about these individuals, archaeologist Raksha Dave is visiting the Wessex labs and meeting osteoarchaeologist Kirsten Dinwiddie.
I want to find out how months of forensic work is building up a detailed picture of the lives of each individual. The skeleton currently being analysed is a middle-aged woman.
So what we do is you use this osteometric board, and then you put the bone in.
Okay, very gentle there.
Yeah.
Right, so that is 44 centimetres.
Okay, so that indicates a fairly average stature.
The thing that I have noticed whilst picking up this bone is it looks really odd around here. It's a bit lumpy bumpy.
It's very lumpy bumpy. If you turn it over, you can see it really is quite disfigured. Around the bone you have a membrane called the periosteum. And if that gets inflamed or irritated in any way, it can cause the bone to overgrow.
So what would have caused that?
Well, any kind of inflammation, so it could be a direct trauma, but this doesn't look like that. The other cause could be some kind of infection throughout the body that might irritate and cause this reaction. And I've got fairly conclusive proof that she suffered from syphilis. If we look at the skull here, it's quite difficult to show, but if you look...
Oh, I can see actually from this angle. So this side is kind of smooth.
Yeah.
And then there's kind of like these knobbly bits here.
Yeah. The particular lesions, they're very characteristic of syphilis. So it sort of eats away at the bone, but then it starts healing. And as it heals, it sort of folds and rolls into the edges. So you get this kind of star-like pattern. And if you look at this, I can actually change the direction of the light source. And actually you can pick ones up.
Incredible.
So where you said it was smooth, you can actually see...
It actually isn't.
No. There is a lesion there.
Do we know if the syphilis was actually contracted or was it congenital?
We think that it was congenital, so that means that her mother had the disease and passed it on to her.
So she had syphilis all her life?
Yeah.
Do we know how she died?
Unusually so, we do in this case. If we just take her skull here, do you notice anything?
Is that what I think it is? Is that a puncture wound?
Yes, it is.
And am I right in thinking if this was an old wound, you would have actually seen signs of the bone regrowing back into
That's
that?
right, and there's absolutely no sign of that at all. And if you notice, it's all sort of folded in.
Somebody stabbed her in the back of the head?
Yeah, so that's just behind the right ear.
What an awful way to go. This poor woman.
This woman's murder may well have been unreported, as was often the case in poorer areas. But the prevalence of chronic diseases was documented. Surveys suggest that around 10% of the urban poor had syphilis. And further work here on a male skeleton is proving just how tough life was in Battersea's 19th century slums.
There is something that I can see,
yes,
and it's pretty obvious. that it looks like somebody's sawn the top of his head off.
That's exactly what they've done. He's had a cranial autopsy, and if you look at the cut marks all around there, you can see where the teeth of the saw have gone round.
Oh yeah, because you can actually see the jagged movements that they've made.
Right. In the 19th century, a craniotomy, removing the top of the head to look at the brain, was a common form of autopsy, especially if, like this man, the individual had suffered psychological or physical problems.
And his skull can tell us quite an interesting story.
I can see immediately that the bridge of his nose has disappeared.
Yes, it's been completely flattened, probably by a number of blows to the bridge of his nose.
So he's obviously been in a fight.
I think he's been in more than one fight. He's been in several fights. If you think of the classic boxer's nose, so it's almost straight like that. And also, he has actually lost his front teeth.
Do you think that's related to his fighting injuries?
It could well be. There's a canal that joins the nasal area to the mouth, and sometimes if that gets damaged, it can form a cyst in the area of trauma. And if you can see the shadow of a cyst, and it's got so large that actually it's worn away the bones there.
Gosh, that must have been incredibly painful.
Yeah, I mean, the pressure must have been quite uncomfortable. You could have had surgery to remove that, but he certainly wouldn't have had the money, so he would have had to have put up with that for his life.
Just from these two skeletons, it's clear that for many, the streets of early industrialised London certainly weren't paved with gold. Disease was rife, and looking at these individuals, beaten, bruised and murdered, life was pretty brutal.
Our next dig takes us to Silchester in Hampshire. Originally an Iron Age settlement, it grew into a Roman town, and since its discovery in 1864, it's been one of the richest Roman sites in Britain, offering a whole range of clues about the life of our Romano-British ancestors. Silchester is an exciting and important Roman site because the town, Caleva Atrebatum, fell into disuse rapidly and was never built over. So what we have is a perfectly preserved Roman town. University of Reading archaeologists have been digging there for more than 20 years, and this year they returned to focus on one particular area, the bathhouse. Now, this important public building should yield clues about how the Romans stamped their identity on Britain.
We've chosen the baths, one of the principal public buildings of the town, because there are questions about when the baths were built, how long they lasted, and about life in the baths. What sort of activities took place, the eating, drinking, the gambling, the hair plucking, the massage, all that sort of activity. What can we trace from the soil itself and from the artefacts that we find?
Because the bathhouse was originally dug 100 years ago, Mike knows exactly where it's located. And since Silchester was never built on after the Romans left, its foundations are quickly revealed. And it's not long until the team start uncovering the precious Roman artefacts they've been hoping for.
Can we see the coin, Libby? That's really clear, isn't it?
Yeah, so you've got a little figure and maybe a spear or a flagpole or something.
Yeah.
Perhaps a torch in the other hand.
Yeah.
There is a head on the other side, but you can't see it very clearly. It doesn't have a beard, which makes it quite early in pre-Hadrian.
The discovery of such an early coin is promising. It suggests that the bathhouse must have been built by at least the early 2nd century. But what's really exciting is the discovery of personal items inside the bathhouse.
I've got a stylus. They would be used as writing implements for wax tablets, and when you hold it in your hand, you can feel how they've balanced it, which is really nice.
Not bad for day 2.
Not bad at all.
The Roman lost property provides an intriguing insight into what was going on in the bathhouse and into who was visiting it 2,000 years ago. They're finding a quantity of rings, necklaces and hairpins, suggesting that many of the bathers were women.
So here we have this bone weaving tablet that would have been used to separate the threads while they were weaving, almost complete. So whether this is specifically a lady's area, if we're finding the jewellery, the hairpins, the weaving tablets, a rather lovely, lovely find.
As the archaeologists delve deeper, they're beginning to reveal astonishing details of the form and fabric of the bathhouse itself.
The quality of the masonry, the preservation of the blocks and the bricks is absolutely superb. I mean, nowhere else, not even within Silchester, will you get preservation of this quality.
And as the dig reaches its third week, the team hit the water table with astonishing results. Water begins to flow through the drains just as it would have done 2,000 years ago. With the foundations in such great condition, the team now hopes that they'll be able to answer the real question at the heart of their mission. When was the bathhouse built? Frustratingly, this key fact has eluded them so far. But on the last day, the archaeologists finally find the evidence they need.
It looks like we found what we were hoping for from this excavation, and that is a Nero-stamped tile. When we use these tracings from existing tiles that we have, the circle fits exactly with the inner and the outer circles, so it's exactly the right dimensions to be a Nero tile.
The stamp dates the tile securely to the time of the Emperor Nero's reign, and this is much earlier than expected. I've invited dig director Mike into the lab to discuss the significance of this surprise.
Mike, you've re-excavated this bathhouse, but what you've done is found this really important bit of dating evidence that you've actually got a Nero tile associated with the bathhouse for the first time.
Yes, that's right. And this is the only place in Britain where we have these tiles.
So with Nero's name, what date does that give us?
Well, it must be sometime after 54. Nero became emperor in 54. The initial invasion began in 43. So sometime, you know, within the first 20 years, they're building the baths. And this is one of the earliest mortared masonry, architecturally designed buildings in Roman Britain that survives.
So this is taking what was an Iron Age settlement and totally transforming it. You know, this is now very much a Roman town on Roman plans.
This is, yes, stamping your, if you like, your symbol of Roman civilization, putting a bathhouse on what was a major Iron Age centre, which you can no longer see through that prism of the Roman town plan.
So how does this work as a building, then? You come in here, what are the various rooms?
So, peristyles, so that's you walk, exercise, warm up, then you come in. This is the changing space. And then you run through a different range of rooms, going through warm, tepidarium, to hot, the caldarium.
So this caldarium, this is where you've got the hypercaust underneath, so heated floors.
Heated floors, hot room, the furnace is outside.
So a sauna, effectively.
Yes, yes. And then you'd round it off with the cold plunge back here.
And plenty of women, it seems, coming and using these baths.
Yes, men at the moment largely invisible. But yes, we've got a range of finger rings, of which the pièce de résistance is this gold finger ring.
Oh, isn't that lovely? Quite tiny.
Yes, that's for a lady or even conceivably for a child.
Yeah.
And this is another lovely one here, but a different material. This is glass.
Oh, that's just beautiful. So these are little items, you know, personal jewellery, which people have lost at the baths.
Yes, yes. But what they lose in abundance are these hairpins. So...
It's just the same today, isn't it? It's hairbands now, I think, at the swimming baths. I'm always losing hairbands at the swimming baths. And these are bone, are they?
They're bone, yes.
Yeah. That's lovely. And do we know who was living there? I mean, is this going to be Roman citizens coming in from the Empire, or is this Brits?
I think predominantly it's Brits. I mean, the town is one of the biggest centres in Britain at the time of the Roman conquest, and a natural centre perhaps to develop.
I mean, it is just extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah, arriving in a new place and going, right, look how lucky you are. We've built you a bathhouse.
Yes, and it's a remarkable story of that early investment in Roman Britain, the confidence of Rome in its newly found province.
Early and rapid investment.
Early and rapid investment, yes.
Discovering this early date for Silchester's bathhouse is fantastic. It's fresh evidence about the determination and speed with which the Roman imperial machine stamped their mark on Britain after the conquest.
When the Romans arrive in Britain, they bring a new culture with them, including characteristic styles of architecture and clothing, pottery and glassware, and, of course, a new language. But there are other, less tangible aspects of Roman culture that also arrived, ideas, stories and myths. And these are beautifully encapsulated in a fantastic artefact here in the museum. Amal, this is such a gorgeous mosaic. How was it discovered?
Well, we didn't know anything about it until 1938, when Herbert Cook, a local farmer, found a sheep dead in his field.
Right.
And he set about burying it. And in that hole, he found a little fragment of a clay tile. So he decided to take it to the museum to get it identified. It wasn't until 1945 that a schoolboy read about the tile, went to see Herbert Cook, and the two of them dug another hole just by chance immediately above the mosaic.
Fantastic. So if it wasn't for the dead sheep and the schoolboy, we wouldn't have this?
We wouldn't, no.
I mean, it's so beautifully preserved, isn't it? And then obviously it got lifted at some point.
Yeah, in 1953, it was quite a big operation to move it, so they stuck fabric to it and rolled it up a bit
so
like a
that's
carpet.
what they're doing here. They're just rolling it up and you can see the pieces of tesserae there. I mean, it is a gorgeous, gorgeous mosaic. And I love the fact that it tells a story.
Yes, and in fact, it's the oldest object in Britain which tells a complete story.
Is it?
Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic.
The mosaic illustrates a chapter from one of the greatest Roman myths, written down by the Roman poet Virgil in the 30s BCE. This part focuses on the tragic love story of the legendary hero Aeneas and the Carthaginian queen Dido.
So it starts here. Aeneas is a refugee from his hometown in Troy, which is in modern-day Turkey.
Yeah.
And he's crossing the Mediterranean on his way to Italy, where it's his destiny to found the city of Rome. And his ships get wrecked on the coast of North Africa.
Right.
So it then moves to this central panel at the back.
Yeah.
And that shows Aeneas leaning nonchalantly on his spear.
Yeah.
And
is that Dido?
That's Dido, yeah. And next to Aeneas is Cupid, because Venus, who's the third figure along, who's the goddess of love and also Aeneas' mother, has decided that she wants to make Aeneas and Dido fall in love.
Okay.
So she's sent Cupid in to make that happen.
And is it working?
I think it is, yes. He's kind of plucking at her shawl, which in classical art is a sort of flirtatious gesture. So
is it?
Seems like Cupid's already working his magic. So then it moves on to the panel which shows a hunting scene. Got Dido at the back, Aeneas in the middle.
Not wearing any clothes?
No.
He's got boots on.
Yeah. And a big storm happens. So Dido and Aeneas seek shelter in a cave.
Ah, right.
And that's this panel here.
Oh, so the denouement of the story. They seem to be falling in love with each other.
They do, yes. They're embracing and they spend the night together in the cave.
So what does happen at the end of the story then? Dido commits suicide?
She does, yeah. Aeneas decides to leave to get on with his mission to found Rome and set sail without telling Dido. Dido is absolutely distraught and decides that the only option is to kill herself.
It's such a tragic story.
It is, yeah.
But it's fantastic to have this story so beautifully laid out. And you can imagine people in that villa walking around telling the stories you've just done.
Definitely. I think it's about the person who commissioned the mosaic showing off his Roman heritage.
Yeah, yeah. And weaving this Roman story into the decoration of his house.
Definitely, yeah.
Our next dig is taking place in the historic city of Bath, where Wessex archaeology have been given an incredible opportunity. They're digging right in the centre, beneath Bath Abbey, one of Britain's most beautiful historic monuments, brimming with an immensely rich and ancient past.
The current abbey at Bath was largely built in the 16th century on the site of an earlier Norman cathedral, and then it was extensively renovated in the 19th century. But now its structure is under threat. The Victorian heating system desperately needs updating, and the floor is starting to collapse. Well, now there's a £19 million restoration project underway, and that's giving archaeologists a golden opportunity to investigate what lies beneath the floor of the abbey.
The lucky team from Wessex Archaeology have 2 years to unlock the abbey's secrets.
Welcome to day one of our dig diary. We're getting our tools together, getting the structures in place for us to be able to go down into the vaults.
Before the construction work happens, the archaeologists have to evaluate every inch of the site, and it's not an easy task.
This is quite a good example of how tricky some of the excavation is, and to work around lots of live surfaces. It's all very cramped in places.
The vaults lie 3.5 metres beneath street level and are crisscrossed with water pipes and cables. And the archaeologists soon discover medieval remains amongst these modern services, proof that the site is going to be highly complicated.
This man would have been absolutely huge, especially for medieval standards. So it's, yeah,
What
quite
sort of
interesting.
heights are we looking at?
We're looking at, yeah, about 6'5".
6'5"?
Yeah, about twice the size of me.
As well as a medieval burial, the vaults also reveal evidence of Bath's ancient Roman origins.
What we've got is demolished Roman hypocaust, which is basically an underfloor heating system.
Right.
And here we've got lots of tesserae, which would have been the mosaic floor that covered the top of it.
The team is getting plenty of glimpses of Bath's rich historic past underneath the pipes, and they're coming across some unexpected surprises too.
So we've got a really nice curving wall around here. It goes under the foundations here, so it's definitely pretty early. Also, it looks like there might be some wall facing on it, so we think they're probably upstanding walls. And potentially earlier than medieval, because there were the cloisters here, and this should have really been an open space, but there's a big wall here, so
Who knows?
This complicated site is throwing up as many questions as answers. And as the team starts work on the floor of the abbey itself, it soon becomes clear why it needs replacing.
This is a grave. There's a coffin underneath that's collapsed, and it's left a hole above it where all the soil's collapsed down into the coffin.
There are an estimated 9,000 burials beneath the abbey, and insufficient underpinning explains why the Victorian floor is now collapsing. But 2 metres deeper down, the archaeologists make a completely unexpected discovery.
It's lovely, isn't it? It's Tudor green glaze.
We've got an intact medieval floor surface here, decorated with these tiles. We believe this is probably late 13th or 14th century. Got various designs. Over here, we've got the 3 lions and shields, which are the arms of the Plantagenet kings. Over here we have the arms of the de Clare family, which are powerful marching lords, and Caerphilly Castle. Quite incredible that this has survived.
This is a wonderful end to the first year of the Bath Abbey Footprint Project, so I've asked Kai into the studio to discuss these findings.
Oh, God, this is absolutely incredible. We're finding so much. You've got a real kind of microcosm of the whole history of Bath, haven't you? You're digging right back to the Roman layers and then coming through to the Norman and medieval layers.
It goes right through, and so it's really got a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the really curious thing was this curved wall. So do you know what that is now?
Possibly. So app structures, curved walls, tend to occur in 2 places. Either you get them in Roman buildings and you get them at the east end of churches or chapels.
Yeah.
So we're right next door to the baths, and you can see here there's a whole series of similar-looking structures. So we thought, could it be part of that? But the mortar's different. It's much more similar to the medieval structures. So the next thing we thought is, could it be part of the Norman Cathedral? And the problem is,
that's where it is.
it's here. It's right in the middle of the cloisters, and you shouldn't have any buildings in this position. This should be open space.
So this in blue on the plan, that's the footprint of the Norman building, and these are the cloisters, and there's your apse.
That's right, yeah. So the other possibility is that it could be part of an earlier church, a late Saxon church.
Oh, really?
Now, we also have a number of Saxon burials in this area, so it could be. We just don't have quite enough to prove it at the moment.
How curious. So there's a phase of demolition in the 16th century when the new abbey is built, and then more demolition and disturbance in the Victorian period.
Yeah, so the east end of the Tudor Abbey had a fan-vaulted stone ceiling, but the nave itself, they built a wooden ceiling there with plaster decoration on it, which we've found evidence of.
Oh, this is some of it, is it?
Yeah, so when the Victorian Restoration happened, they essentially ripped out what they saw as things that didn't match the original design, which included this, and we found dozens and dozens of these little rosettes, amongst other decorated plaster. So it gives us a really good idea of what the ceiling of the abbey looked like.
So this is Tudor?
Yes.
Yeah. And what about that tile?
So this tile, I believe this is early 15th century, and this coat of arms is the coat of arms of King Edmund, the first King of England, who was incidentally crowned at Bath Abbey. He wouldn't have recognised these arms because it was invented about 300 years after he died. But the kings of the time thought that he was a king, therefore he needed a coat of arms. So this is what they created.
I mean, that's just amazing to find those tiles. What about this coin? What's that?
Yeah, so this was a bit of a surprise. This was actually found by the workmen when they were lifting the pews inside the abbey.
It's got a little devil on it. Yes. It says the city of the devil, Civitas Diaboli.
Yeah, and on the other side it's got a date and the name Anholt, which is an island off the coast of Denmark.
It's a recent date, 1973.
Yes.
That's actually the same vintage as me.
So we looked into this a little bit, and the date it describes is when 13 supposedly ritual sites were found on this island. One of them had a fake shrunken head on it, and people started wondering, is this some kind of cult activity? And shortly after this, these coins started appearing in churches all over Denmark and Sweden. Nobody knew where they were coming from. And then in 2013, it turned out it was all the work of a clerk at the Danish National Gallery, and it was all an elaborate hoax.
Really?
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? The little devil under the floor in Bath Abbey. Although just halfway through, this dig is already providing rare glimpses of what lies beneath one of our most treasured historic cities. And with a year to go, who knows what other secrets will be uncovered. Next, it's back to Wessex archaeology in Salisbury, where Raksha is with archaeologists who are investigating the remains of an early 19th century pauper's graveyard. And it's becoming clear just how terrible the living conditions were at the time.
Rachel, you were the site director for this excavation. How was the preservation on site?
The preservation on site was really very good. We found organic remains that we wouldn't expect to find.
So what have you got in that dish over there? Because that looks rather curious.
It is, and it's not something that you would expect to find very often. It is a desiccated brain.
That's rather small. Is that just a portion of the brain?
No, this is a complete brain. But this is a brain from a 9 or 10-year-old child.
And is that from this individual?
Yes, it is. We did find quite a large number of children, and this is one of the children that we found.
I can see here that there's green staining around the eyes.
Yes, so this is where coins were placed over the child's eyes. The parents, although they were very likely to have been incredibly poor, cared an awful lot for their children, and one of the ways they've shown that is by placing the coins on the eyes. Coins they could probably very ill afford.
And you have another child skeleton here.
Yes, we do, and this was probably the most poignant find we had from the entire site. This was an individual that still had a legible nameplate as we uncovered it. So we could decipher part of the legible nameplate, we could decipher the date she died and how old the nameplate said she was. Next to you, you'll see a photograph, and this was her nameplate. She was called Jane Clara J, and she died aged 1 year. We've been able to find her baptism certificates and her death certificates.
Do we know very much about her?
We know a little bit. We know that she was 22 months when she passed away. Her father was a labourer called George, and she lived in the Nine Elms area of Battersea.
And by studying her skeleton, can you tell how she died?
The bones tell us that it was probably some sort of chronic or severe infection that killed her.
So is infant mortality high?
Infant mortality is extremely high. In the streets surrounding this site, the infant mortality is 25% on average for this period. There's an awful lot of industrialisation within the Battersea area, so you're getting chemical factories, acid factories, some really nasty stuff, and it's quite grim living conditions for these people.
So this is very commonplace, it's literally survival of the fittest.
It's survival of the fittest and the luckiest. There were a lot of diseases like cholera, typhoid, but if you were fortunate enough you might make it to adulthood, and if you were unfortunate or unwell you would end up as poor Jane Clara J did, within the cemetery.
Our final dig takes us to the ancient monument of Barrow Clump on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, where archaeologists are investigating a cache of richly furnished burials. Barrow Clump is a 3,000-year-old Bronze Age burial mound, a barrow lying just 5 miles west of Stonehenge. It's such a big feature in the landscape that 1,500 years later, the Anglo-Saxons chose to bury their dead here too. But now this site is potentially in danger of destruction.
Archaeological sites can be threatened by anything from the construction of new roads and railways to coastal erosion. But at our next site, Barrow Clump, the problem was a little more unusual.
Salisbury Plain is an MOD training ground, and military vehicles continually thunder by during manoeuvres. To assess whether this has caused any damage, a familiar face, MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood, is investigating with his team of ex-soldiers.
Morning one at Barrow Clump, summer 2018, stripping an area underneath the tracks to see the effective ground pressure of vehicles on the Saxon cemetery that lies below.
Only digging will reveal the true extent of this cemetery. That is, if the precious evidence hasn't been destroyed by the tanks. But the initial signs are promising.
Morning 3 on Barrow Clump, and the graves are emerging. There's an area of burning which has got human bone on top of it, and next to that there's another complete grave.
But as they dig down, the team's confidence about the level of preservation is shaken.
Through the skull.
Yeah.
I believe this could be the shoulder, arm, pelvis, and then legs.
Okay, so it's looking a bit friable. The bones look a bit delicate. Is that right at the moment?
The skulls, as you can see,
yeah, it's squashed, isn't it?
Yeah.
Part of the skull there, so it's actually broken.
Okay.
The level of survival is disappointing, and for the next few days, things don't improve. But on day 4...
We have a square-headed brooch here, which probably comes in a pair, and further down the trench, there's a little bit of green coming out there.
Brooches like this are often found in graves of wealthy Anglo-Saxon women. The discovery is a welcome sign that further valuable evidence might survive. And as other burials are uncovered, the team finds grave goods often associated with male burials.
We found the grave cut that goes all the way around towards a really nice shield boss.
That's a really good nick, isn't it?
It's lovely, yeah, it's really nice.
The boss is the metal centrepiece to a wooden shield that is entirely rotted away. Anglo-Saxon men were often buried with shields laid over them. And there are more metal artefacts clearly hidden beneath the ground.
Getting a strong iron signal, dead centre of the small pit there, so slowly go down.
Every bleep of the metal detector increases the anticipation on site. And on the final day, the team uncovers what for them is the most exciting find of the entire dig.
Well, what you got?
Seem to have a sword.
That's really cool. You can see the hilt, and there's the bones, there's the arm, the humerus.
And after hours of careful excavation, the incredible preservation of this rare object is apparent.
So that's the end of the year at Barrow Clump. We've had 27 graves, and probably the most spectacular being the individual buried in the grave in front of me with his sword and all the grave fittings. A really, really astonishing sight. But this must be the most spectacular we've had so far.
I've invited Richard into the studio with that sword to discuss all of the finds from Barrow Clump this year.
It's quite incredible to think that this man, he's right underneath the tank tracks.
That's right. We were looking this year just to see how damaging our military vehicles were. The answer is actually it's not doing a huge amount of damage. And yes, this was quite a spectacular find in the last week of the dig.
You seem quite excited to find the sword at the end.
If you're digging with a military team, they all want to find weaponry. And what could be more perfect than something as wonderful as this, really?
Yeah.
It's in pretty good condition. It has the scabbard mouth there, made of bronze, possibly a horn handle to it. And then to find this with what the soldiers perceived as a warrior, is quite something. He had a spear, he had a ring-headed pin, and gloriously he had tweezers as well.
So these are tweezers?
Yeah, some iron tweezers. And we found little bronze tweezers with female burials before, but it was good to see that he too had a part of a toilet set with him, a part of his grooming.
Yeah, he would have looked after himself.
Yeah, absolutely so.
And, of course, just because you found weaponry, a magnificent sword and a spear, you can't assume that this is a male burial. But I think this time, I mean, it's very obvious, isn't it? These are very long bones, large joints. Looking at the jaw, That's an incredibly robust jawline
Right,
there.
well, that's very masculine then.
Yeah.
In this case, they do seem to be quite gender-specific on our site, and the burials with jewellery are of females and the weaponry are of males. So that's what we've got at Barraclump.
So you have got quite a few female burials, and these are some of the beads from those then?
Yes, these are just one collection of grave goods from a female burial, but
From
really,
one burial?
From one burial, yes. They all come. They're
those
absolutely
beads?
stunning, aren't they? With the iridescent blues and the
Yeah.
orange ambers and the glass. Really, really exquisite items.
Really lovely.
And you've got soldiers arguing who's got the prettier jewels in the grave they're digging. It's not something they'd probably have expected in the mess 10 years before. And really excitingly with this one was this little brooch, because this is a one-off from a grave in Britain. This is Visigothic. The Visigoths, a group that's moved from Germany to northern Spain or southern France, and it gives us all those sort of questions as to whether the individual was accompanied with these things, whether she was in fact from that region or whether she's a British woman that's adopted fashions of another grouping.
I think identity is really difficult in this period, well, any period actually, because she might have had some Visigoth ancestry whilst growing up in this country. We
Completely
can't
that,
tell
and
that at the
we've had
moment.
Roman brooches as well, so that also asks the questions whether these are heirlooms or whether they've just been found on Salisbury Plain, which is always a possibility given the amount of archaeology there.
Yeah, and do we know where these people lived? I mean, is there a settlement
Well, you've
nearby?
got good Saxon place names of Ablington and Fildene, which is just below it on the River Avon, both mentioned in the Domesday Book. I think that probably is where they're living, just down the hill.
And then presumably choosing to site their cemetery further up the hill where there are Bronze Age barrows up there.
I think it's that continuity of landscape, isn't it? People are using that landscape as a venerated spot. They're looking up onto the hillside, and I do think that these places were significant in the Saxon period with the knowledge that they were where ancestors, for want of a better word, were placed in prehistory.
Each and every dig reveals how archaeology can shed new light on the story of Britain. From discovering why HMS Invincible transformed British sea power in the 18th century, to revealing the horrific realities of life and death for London's poor 150 years ago. Our ancestors made the country we live in today, and through archaeology we've been able to reach back through the centuries and touch their lives. We might be a small island, but we've got an epic history. And there's a wealth of untold secrets still to uncover. So every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive, and sift to find clues.
Absolutely never seen anything like it before.
It's amazing.
In 2018, their discoveries have been more exciting than ever.
Look at that.
So that's from a tank then? That's brilliant. That's a nice find.
Not bad for day 2.
Not bad at all.
Each excavation has been filmed as it happened by the archaeologists themselves. Their dig diaries mean that we can be there for every exciting moment of discovery.
And you imagine him looking over his shoulder, trying to get away from the enemy aircraft through that.
I'll be in the lab where the teams will bring in their finds from pottery and metalwork to human remains, and we'll take a closer look to find out what these new digs can tell us about our ancestors. Look at that.
Be very careful.
I will be careful. Oh my goodness.
While archaeologist Raksha Dave looks into the analysis that goes on long after a dig is finished.
Somebody stabbed her in the back of the head. What an awful way to go.
Welcome to Digging for Britain. In this programme, I'm joining archaeologists in the east of Britain and beyond as they share their biggest discoveries. We join a team as they find an incredible lost Stone Age monument.
It has to mean something, and it's now our job is to figure out what it does mean.
And we uncover an unusual Roman burial site that seems to defy explanation.
This is actually the 17th out of 32 which show deviancy in the form of decapitation.
And at Norwich Castle Museum, I'll discover how one of the objects held here helps us to tell the story of Eastern Britain. First, we travel a bit further east than usual to investigate the key World War I battle of Bullecourt in a French foreign field that is forever England. By 1917, a devastating land war had been raging in Europe for 3 years. That spring, Germany made the strategic decision to retreat behind a massive fortified defence they'd constructed across northern France. It was known to the British as the Hindenburg Line. The line was almost impenetrable, with a set of 6 trenches, and in front of that another 90 metres of barbed wire. The Allies had to breach it, though, or face the terrible prospect of an even longer war. So the British decided to try out their latest, barely tested invention, the tank. The plan at Bullecourt was straightforward. 12 British tanks would advance to the Hindenburg Line, crash through the defences, followed by troops of Australian infantry. But in the end, it was a disaster. Only 2 tanks got anywhere near the line, leading to a catastrophic loss of Australian life. The Australians felt badly betrayed, and one general even accused the tank crews of cowardice. MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood is leading this battlefield dig.
What we're looking for is the points where the tanks of the British Army attacked in 1917, and to find out why they were destroyed where they were, to answer the question that was levelled at some of the crews, that they perhaps lacked moral fibre. Maybe there's an element of cowardice in some ways, not helping to assist the Australian infantry in their attack on the German Hindenburg Line.
The team have an idea where they might find one of these tanks, because the Germans took photographs of it after their victory. Richard's archaeologists are ex-soldiers from Britain, Australia, and Germany.
Well, the edge of the trench is about here, so it has a little sloop in it.
They've served in recent conflicts from Afghanistan to Iraq, giving them an insight into war's worst realities. And it doesn't take long before they find evidence of the Hindenburg Line's brutal design.
What we appear to have here, German barbed wire. You can see it's really thick, it's well over-engineered, pretty nasty stuff. You'll certainly get tangled up in that and be shot, no doubt.
And then Richard's team are brought face to face with the tragic consequences of this battle for Bullecourt. A reminder that there were casualties on both sides.
This chap here is a German casualty lying in the Hindenburg Line. This is his skull. He's facing this way. He seems to be in quite a mess, doesn't he, Isabel? He's kind of twisted this way. The vertebrae suddenly stop there.
They can tell from the equipment around him that he was a German soldier. It's important to these former soldiers to take a moment to remember the fallen.
War is a great leveller. He's a human being. He could be British, he could be Australian, he could be French. In this case, he's German, and it's all exactly the same.
Ja, Highness, Kamerad. This is not easy, but 100 years ago, we might have fought against each other. But because of this war, we're now standing here together. Not as enemies, but as friends. Auf dich, Kamerad.
Fallen comrades.
Fallen comrades.
The next day, the team continue their quest for the tank.
I can't believe we're making so many finds already. We've got lots of tank parts that are coming out of the ground. We've got parts of the engine, we've got parts of the driving chain, we've got some of the components from within the tank as well.
Because of the documentary evidence and photos, Richard knows that he's looking at the remains of Tank 796, commanded by Lieutenant Hugh Skinner. And the only tank that made it all the way to the Hindenburg Line. It broke down in a crater in full view of the German artillery. In the reports of the battle, written by Australian generals, British tank crews were accused of cowardice and incompetence. So is it possible that Skinner and his crew abandoned their Australian allies?
Got some tank armour.
Oh, right, that's part of the plate from the side, is it?
Yes.
So look, being an armoured vehicle with something like this, I mean, is that going to protect you against shell blast?
No, not at all. Protects you against small arms.
So against bullets, good. Against shells, that's really not going to work.
No.
So that's pretty terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah.
The armour plating was clearly not able to withstand the firepower it faced. With his tank immobilised and under heavy fire, Skinner and his crew would have been sitting ducks, so the last find of the dig is a revelation.
Leave it there, Paul. And that's possibly the end of a shell. Okay.
It's hollow.
Okay, we'll keep cleaning it. That looks a cart case.
I think so.
Cartridge.
It's got curvature.
So in which case we need to get
on it.
Dave over to have a look.
Brush.
That was a 6-pounder case. Well, that's what the guys have been thinking.
Yeah, that's what it is, 6-pounder case.
So that's from a tank then?
Yeah.
That's brilliant. That's a nice find.
This empty casing suggests a 6-pound tank shell was fired on this very spot. They were firing the remains of their ammo until the bitter end.
When the tank was basically broken down here, in his report he said he carried on firing, trying to use as much of his ammunition up as possible before they retreated to the Australian and British lines over there. And this kind of proves that he was firing from this spot where the tank was broken.
So this item is, yeah, it's a symbol of bravery.
I've asked Richard to join me in the lab to share the powerful evidence he's uncovered to contradict the Australian accusations of cowardice.
This is basically the archaeology of a day. This is the archaeology of one day in April 1917 and the traces it leaves behind in these French fields.
Have you found out anything else that we couldn't have known just from the history that's come down to us?
Yes. I mean, the armour, it's just metal. It's not armoured as we'd understand it. It's that sort of level of thickness. It's really great for stopping bullets, but not for stopping artillery. The crews must have known that very, very quickly, and it must have been just terrifying. So these are the tanks that are brought in for training for the British Army. They've used them on the Somme in 1916, but this is going to be the breakthrough weapon, but they're only for training. I suppose shock and awe is the thing they were trying to achieve, of having this monster attacking the infantry, and that's great if you can't shoot through it.
I mean, it seems extraordinary that you're saying that essentially this is a training tank. I mean, this tank is firing shells of that size, and presumably the Germans are firing back similar size
Pretty
shells.
similar. This is a 6-pounder case, and the Germans are firing back 7.7 centimetre artillery, which is pretty much the same sort of size, and it was going straight through the metal of these tanks.
And what's this image here?
We all think we know what colours the tanks are. The only way you can really tell what the original paint was like on these things is if you find it in the ground. And we were incredibly fortunate to find that paint on one of the tracks of 796. So you've got two colours there. You've got the red, which is the undercoat, and then a green tone on top of it. That colour is British racing green.
Yeah.
On a thing that does 4 miles an hour.
Does that make them stand out more, do you think?
Well, they've done all sorts of different colour schemes, and they're experimenting. It's such a new weapon. They're even experimenting with the colours that are going on to this thing. People are learning lessons and desperately trying to break through this huge siege that's going on the Western Front.
So the Germans had nothing like this?
No, nothing at all. In fact, the main use of tanks that the Germans have in the First World War are captured British tanks, Beutpanzer. It's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory in some ways, in that the Germans look at the results of the fire that they put out against these tanks and where they've destroyed them and how they've destroyed them, and they employ those tactics later on in other battles. But by then, the British are not using training tanks, they're using properly armoured vehicles.
Right.
And that leads to successes like the Battle of Cambrai, just a few months later, where there are much more effective vehicles.
And what about this tale of cowardice, then? I mean, where does this excavation leave us?
Well, hopefully that's dispelled any sorts of thoughts like that. It comes from the Australians, who took a lot of casualties in this one particular battle, perhaps looking for a scapegoat, and these tank crews were that obvious example to pin it on. The fact that this tank got as far as it did, it fired until its ammunition was either expended or the tank was utterly unable to maintain itself without being destroyed. It does 4 miles an hour over a big area. They've seen the other tanks being destroyed. To stay as long as they did and to get as far as they did, I think actually it's quite the reverse. I think it's a tale of courage.
Yeah. This excavation shows that the tragic failure at Bulgur was a failure of machines and not men. We now know that the crew of Tank 796 fought bravely until their very last shell. We go back to the UK now, where archaeologists are investigating a huge 37-kilometre-long stretch of farmland before the laying of a power line near Woodbridge. Every time a major UK building project is greenlit, then maps have to be consulted, the land is surveyed, and often an excavation is carried out. Now, the archaeologists don't set out to make spectacular finds, but sometimes they will uncover a major new discovery, and that's exactly what happened this year in Suffolk. The Suffolk landscape has been ploughed and levelled for centuries. So when the commercial archaeologists started work, expectations were low. But right at the end of the project, the survey showed something interesting hidden under the soil. When they start to dig, they get a huge surprise. It looks like this very flat patch of land was once a hill, and under the flattened hill, they uncover a monumental curving ditch.
The scale of the ditch is massive. It's about 15 metres wide. It's at least 2 to 3 metres deep. That is a very, very large feature, which would have been huge in the landscape when it was around.
Digging this ditch must have been a colossal undertaking, suggesting that this was a very important site. Through the bitterly cold winter, the team works as fast and as carefully as they can, peeling back each layer of earth filling the ditch. Then comes the next shock. There's a perfectly preserved wooden trackway inside the ditch that would have led to the top of the hill.
The trackway itself came down on a ramp just beside us on split oak timbers and then runs up along the centre of the ring ditch and terminates at the very highest point on the hill.
With no precedent for such a strange design, the team don't know if they're looking at something that is hundreds or thousands of years old. But it's clear that they've unearthed an enormous monument and something that had been entirely forgotten about. As the trackway emerges, the archaeologists can see that it's about 3 metres wide, and further analysis reveals it's made of birch and oak. The big question is now when this mysterious monument was constructed and why. And they start to find objects that appear to have been deliberately placed in the ditch.
There's an obvious placing of certain bones in certain locations along the trackway, but we're finding none of the other bones. We're only finding pelvic bones and jaw bones, which is sort of the front of the animal and the back of the animal, with nothing in between. And that in itself is extraordinarily unusual.
The wood and the bone can be dated, and they turn out to be very old indeed. They're from 2400 BCE, so this feature is Stone Age. At this time, we know that people were gathering to create giant monuments in significant places in the landscape. The most famous of these, of course, is Stonehenge, which also has a large curving ditch around it. But there the similarities end. This new discovery, though, raises the possibility that many more giant monuments could be hidden in our landscape, each one unique and each with its own purpose. This henge-like monument has one last important secret. The team finds a large platform at the top of the hill, built to hold the weight of many people.
So we're standing on the highest point on the hillside where the ring ditch occurs, and you can see behind us the remains of the supporting structure for the depositional platform.
And not only that, there are natural springs on site that seem to have been redirected to fill the ditch with water. The wooden trackway and platform would have allowed people to walk over the water, and it seems that they were deliberately dropping objects like the animal bone into it. This is an extraordinary, unique and puzzling feat of ancient engineering.
We think that it's part of the actual ceremonial purpose of the platform, is that people come to the top of it and they deposit material to run down along the hillside in the flowing water.
It is difficult to think of a functional reason for building a structure like this, and the archaeologists believe it had a ritual purpose.
That makes this an almost magical experience, and if you're coming in from the creek below, the water will be rushing down on either side like a large prehistoric water feature.
For site director Vinny, this is the find of a lifetime.
It has been a phenomenal site, once in a career site for me, and I think for everybody here, they've witnessed nothing of the likes of what we've excavated over the last 7 months. It's been a real roller coaster.
I've asked the team into the lab to explain how this remarkable site is changing our knowledge of the ritual landscape of prehistoric Britain.
That is an incredible site. And is it a henge? Can we describe it as that?
I think it's certainly related to those sorts of things. Henges, we now know, relate to water and the use of water and presumably the veneration of the ancestors and the journey to the afterlife. It's quite possible that people had their feet in the water when they were walking along the trackway. It's not a place where they were living and it's an occupation site. It's a site with a special function.
So, yeah, this is the elephant in the room. we've been kind of ignoring this, but it's absolutely magnificent. So this is a prehistoric cow.
A very large prehistoric cow.
Yeah. I mean, it's
a very large
absolutely
one that we were very pleased to see.
Yeah.
Because it allowed us to have an indication of what date we were dealing with, because when you find an aurochs, it tells you that whatever you've got, it's Middle Bronze Age or earlier, because they are extinct in Britain as of the Middle Bronze Age.
And where did you find it?
So we found this just off the end of the platform, just within arm's reach, so it's deposited off the side. And along with that, we found this wooden bladed agricultural artefact as well.
So it's not just a piece of wood?
No, it's a wooden spatula, and it's used for butter and milk churning. It's the same thing. You're getting the association of agricultural practices with the aurochs skull in the placement at the edge of this platform.
I mean, these are the earliest farmers, aren't they? This is early Neolithic. This is the beginning of farming in Britain.
From the carbon-14 dating that we've just recently had back, we're looking at it to be about 3,500 BC.
So that's really early Neolithic.
Very early, and that's from the lowest phase of the trackway, so the very first phase of trackway.
And when we're thinking of this time period, we're always kind of drawn to Stonehenge, just because that is such an obvious feature still in our landscape. But it's quite curious to see that there were things like this that have been forgotten about.
Stonehenge is famous for its kind of lifespan. Now, what we can tell from this site in particular is that it has a similar lifespan. Outside of our site, from the surveying that we've done also, we can see there's a much larger sequence of monumental activity in that whole valley side, which is prehistoric. It's something that those people and their descendants have kept coming back to for thousands of years.
This astonishing site reveals that our prehistoric ancestors came together to build a spectacular water feature and returned here over more than 1,000 years. But unlike Stonehenge, this monument was flattened and lost until now. It's still early days, but the Woodbridge site looks set to become the stuff of archaeological legend.
We cover many exciting digs on this series, but in fact, the excavation is only the start of a long journey of discovery. Once finds and samples are retrieved, they're sent off to labs for conservation and analysis, a process that can take weeks, months, sometimes even years. And for this next dig in Silchester, it is only when the samples arrive in the lab that the real details begin to emerge.
Field archaeologist Raksha Dave is travelling to Portslade to find out how post-excavation work following a Silchester dig is making sense of Britain's lost landscapes.
For the last 2 years, Southern Water have been laying a 10-kilometre pipeline, cutting through town and country, and they paid Archaeology Southeast to monitor their work. As they dug the areas where the pipes were to be laid, they found prehistoric henges, Roman settlement and burial, and RAF bases from World War II. But most intriguingly, they have unearthed a buried medieval village. There are an awful lot of buckets here.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. So these are just some of the hundreds of samples that we've recovered from the village itself. They are soil, basically, from archaeological deposits, like, for example, fills of ditches and pits.
So you've got a plan here. As they excavated along the line of the future water pipe and uncovered the footprint of the lost village, they mapped the details.
So you can see there's boundary ditches, there's post holes relating to structures.
To access this time capsule of medieval life, they've dug up entire sections of the ground and brought them back to the lab. The clues to the people who lived in this village are hidden in the soil. But first, they need to get rid of a lot of mud. Good grief. Then, do I just break these bits up then?
Yeah, so all we're trying to do is break it down. The water will do some of the work for it.
This is quite a bizarre job.
It is.
It's like, what do you do for a living? Oh, I wash mud.
It's almost like massaging it, though, so it's very intimate. What we're trying to do is get rid of all the soil, so we end up with all the lovely archaeological material.
I can actually feel all the tiny bits.
Yeah. And this one, on top of this mesh, will have all the heavy stuff that won't float, but then some lighter things like charcoal and plant remains will float, and we'll end up with them in this smaller one.
The large tank at the top will catch stone, tile and metal, and the small mesh below it catches lighter plant remains. So how do you then use all of this information about this organic remains to paint a picture of village life?
If, for example, we have a sample with lots of charcoal in it, it could be from an oven or a kiln. We can identify certain types of charcoal as being fuel wood.
Yeah, so you can see where they're selecting certain types of trees to burn, or if they're avoiding any, whether they're cutting down trees to use as fuel, or whether they are just picking from the forest floor.
It just amazes me how much information you can get from such a tiny piece of charcoal. Extracting all of this information requires an expert eye, so they are passed to archaeobotanist Angela for analysis. Gosh, this is quite painstaking stuff.
And then I listen to music on the day.
These innocuous bits of seed and charcoal can give us an intimate insight into the everyday lives of the people in this village. Germinated grains showed that they were brewing ale. The charcoal shows us where they were cooking, and the cereal can tell us about the bread they were eating.
In medieval times, both wheat and barley were used for making flour because wheat was a bit of a high-status cereal, so not everybody could afford to eat bread that was made entirely out of wheat.
After all of these samples are sorted and analysed, the team will be able to work out what people were doing in different parts of the site. And the larger finds from the excavation are providing intriguing clues to the village's fate. Where has this material come from?
Well, all of this tile has come from a spread that was overlying one side of the best preserved house that we had on the site.
We know that there are 2,000 fragments of tile here weighing close to 40 kilograms, and that's a significantly large amount to get from a single feature.
Tile was a valuable resource and often reused. Such a large quantity left untouched after the building's collapse suggests that the entire village was abandoned. So it's literally collapsed down and all the tiles just spread onto the ground?
Where it drops, yeah.
The fabric of this particular tile is quite distinctive. You can see it's got quite large flint inclusions. And we can say that it's between 1150 and 1350 AD.
This medieval date gives an important clue as to why this village disappeared.
But that's a classic feature of the deserted medieval village in the mid-14th century, where you just get, obviously, massive depopulation. You're going through a cold phase that hits around the time, the so-called Little Ice Age. That has a knock-on effect with, like, impact on food, on harvests. You've got the Black Death rolls in around that time. You've got the 100 Years' War as well, which would have been a drain on the population. When you combine them all together, it must have been pretty devastating.
The date of this collapsed building shows that the perfect storm of climate change, disease, and political turmoil signalled the end for this particular village. It's early days, but it's likely these buckets of mud hold many more of the village's secrets for the archaeologists to uncover.
Our next site takes us to the village of Great Wellnotham in Suffolk, where a team were brought in to investigate a small field ahead of a housing project, because evidence of Roman activity had already been found in the surrounding area. This dig is making us question Roman burial practice in Britain.
When it comes to the Romans, a fort or a villa looks very similar whether it's in northern Africa or eastern Britain. So archaeologists often half know what they're going to find even before they start digging. But some sites defy all the expectations.
When the team arrived on site, they found evidence of burials. There's nothing unusual about this, but it meant the site had to be fully excavated. 5 weeks in, they make what seems to be a gruesome discovery.
So I've got a child between about 4 and 8 years old, and he's what we call a deviant burial, which means it's been placed in an unusual way or buried in an unusual practice. You can see the head has been removed from where it should be and is in between the legs. So we've got the arms coming down like this, the 2 legs on either side which are spread, and the head right in the middle.
There are examples of strange burials like this, decapitated with the head rearranged, from other Roman cemeteries, but they're rare, and we don't know why the dead body would be treated in this way. As the dig continues, there are plenty of more normal-looking graves, so it looks like the deviant burial is a one-off. But it isn't.
So far, I'm uncovering this grave where we have this skeleton, possibly deviant. We're not entirely sure yet if the skull belongs to the skeleton, but I believe it could be from this skeleton because by the pelvis and by the skull, it seems to be female.
This burial is even stranger than the last.
We also have feet, but they do not belong to this skeleton, so it's obvious that we have several redeposits on the same grave.
This body appears to have been buried with an extra pair of feet, which must have been removed from their owner, fully fleshed. Over the next few days, more deviant burials emerge.
We're missing the top vertebrae from over here, so it's very likely that this skull does belong to this individual, and we've got clear evidence of decapitation having occurred on site, so we've got yet another deviant burial.
We have another presumed decapitation where the head has been placed underneath the lower limbs.
And we have Brunner excavating our 17th decapitation burial. This is actually the 17th out of 32 which show deviancy in the form of decapitation, with the head out of its correct anatomical position.
Well over half of the people buried in this cemetery have been decapitated, and even more peculiarly, several have extra body parts with them. This is a large number of deviant burials for a single cemetery. So what does it mean? I've asked Rebecca Redfern from the Museum of London and lead archaeologist Kerry Bull into the lab to help solve this mystery.
I suppose what's absolutely crucial to understand about this, we talk about decapitation, but what we need to try to understand is whether that is somebody being beheaded as the cause of their death, or whether actually they're already dead and you're removing the head of a dead body.
I think in this case, with this particular woman, I think we're fitting more of a funerary ritual rather than as an execution. I mean, the cemetery is very strange.
Yeah,
So
I mean, what we do seem to have all of the decapitation burials, they have purposely moved the head from anatomical position, and they tend to have it in the lower limb
area, so it seemed to have been important to them to remove that head and put them somewhere else, whereas normally with some sort of execution burials, all you need to do is chop off their head and kill them.
I mean, I think this is obviously part of a culture where if this is happening after death, this is just what you do with a dead body, and it's kind of assumed in the same way that, you know, what we do with dead bodies now is cremate them, grind them up and put them in a pot. And there's not necessarily thought going into that process every time. But where do you think it comes from? What's the motivation?
It's really interesting because a lot of the time, a lot of the decapitation or even prone burials, so people are buried face down or in unusual positions, they're covered with stones. And so we think that is like, definitely, we are making sure you never come back.
So can you tell anything about this other individual here?
I mean, this lady appears to have experienced quite a physical lifestyle. If we look at her elbow joint, it's very shiny. So it's lovely and shiny.
Yeah, look like ivory, doesn't it? So she's lost all the cartilage there.
Yeah, in her elbow and then again in her wrist at the bottom of the ulna.
Yeah.
And then her finger phalanges, one appears to be broken and one appears to be infected. And there seems to be a little bit of joint disease as well in her skeleton, and all of the maxillary teeth have been lost for quite a long time because it's all pinched back together, and it's made her face look very kind of caved in. It's not something that I would really expect to see because she doesn't appear to be that old.
Do we have any idea who these people might have been? You know, where they stood in Roman society?
There's a site down the road where they've actually found a slave manacle of around about the same period. And so maybe we could have a funerary rite associated with slave burials. And that's why we're getting a lot of this degenerative bone disease, reflecting that kind of lifestyle.
Do you think that's a reasonable hypothesis?
I think so. For the Romans to really kind of get the rural economy going, they have to import a huge number of people, both from the continent, but also they're moving people around Britain and they're enslaved.
And that's really interesting too, because when we look at Roman Britain, we're often talking about the civilised nature of it. But here we've got something that prefigures medieval serfdom.
Oh, absolutely. We know one of the big exports in the late Iron Age are slaves from Britain. So the Romans just really ramp that part of the economy up. And also the fact that anyone could be a slave. You get people who may not show us that they've suffered a hard childhood because they might have had a fairly affluent life but then become enslaved as adults. And that's what we're seeing. So it's very, very complicated. But for me, for the research that I've done, I would say this is very convincing.
This is a slave cemetery?
Yes.
We still don't really understand why these bodies were decapitated. But by identifying these people as slaves, the cemetery could help to shed light on that darker side of Roman rule. Now we travel forward in time 1,200 years to Hampshire and a chance discovery of a stash of coins that might throw some light on one of the most turbulent periods in our British history. In April 2018, Canadian metal detectorist Darcy Fear was holidaying in Hampshire. Back home, he'd been passionate about his hobby for decades, even though he'd had little success.
Thursday morning, it was a beautiful day. I started metal detecting, and it was my first signal. I was only there 10, 15 minutes. And I was just so amazed that I found something so incredible.
Darcy's holiday was about to become the archaeological experience of a lifetime.
When I dug the top of the soil, and then I saw the first bit of pottery on the ground, well then, the last shovelful, when we lifted it out, it was just coins everywhere. So it was, we knew what we had then, or I did anyway, so, yeah.
Incredibly, having just arrived in the UK, Darcy had discovered a hoard of buried coins. All the visible ones were nearly 400 years old. They'd probably been hidden here in the Civil War.
During the English Civil War, the country was split, torn apart by fighting between Charles I's Royalists and Cromwell's Roundheads. But while the history books can provide us with details of the battles and the bloodsheds, the names of leaders even, archaeology reveals the details of ordinary lives.
Although on foreign turf, Darcy knew exactly what he should do when he made his discovery.
I know the rules, so we're not supposed to touch anything once you find a hoard. So we didn't until we got a hold of an archaeologist. By the end of the day, they finally let us dig it ourselves.
Having sought permission and then with careful supervision, the hoard was lifted.
Then we put the whole thing into a bucket to keep it together and then cover it with a wet rag. And then, you know, the bucket alone weighed 100 pounds just with mostly dirt.
By taking such care, Darcy and the archaeologists hope that they've removed the entire hoard in a single block. And then the conservation team at the British Museum take over.
Very quickly after I started excavating, I started seeing the rim of the vessel, which was very lucky because then I realized this is what I was working with.
The pot looks to be intact, meaning that it could be just as its owner had placed it there 400 years ago. So Dugu begins to work very slowly and methodically.
This is really a micro excavation, so if I was on site excavating your find, this is exactly I would be doing it, yeah.
Dugu carries out this mini dig with almost surgical skill. And she notices something remarkable about the way the coins were placed inside the pot.
It looks like in this layer that I've been excavating, the coins are stuck next to each other and upwards.
It's hard to believe, really, you know, to find something like this.
Senior conservator Pippa Pearce thinks that the owner of the hoard had sorted the money into neat little stacks. Someone who clearly intended to come back to them.
Because that would mean that they were in a hurry, they weren't about to be murdered, they weren't counting their money out neatly and then just putting it into a pot and hiding it.
And the stacks of silver coins just keep on coming.
So we've got 23 coins out at the moment. You reckon there's as many again or more?
I think there's 200 coins in there.
Whoa!
The coins are in great condition despite being in the ground for so long.
So you can see his beard.
These ones are in nice
Yes,
shape. You see
very
you can
little corrosion.
See
yeah.
the dates on those ones as plain as day. Amazing.
So to have what is a really good condition hoard and to be able to excavate it in the lab is just brilliant for us.
So why did this person bury their wealth? I'm speaking to British Museum coin expert Barry Cook to find out more about this incredible hoard.
So we've got Edward VI all the way through Elizabeth, James, through to Charles. What's the time depth there?
We have 100 years, pretty much, of English monarchy.
Yeah.
We could have had older coins, except that Henry VIII debased the coinage and left it in a terrible state. So it was up to his children, Edward VI, Mary and Elizabeth, to try and sort that out. Edward and Mary both issued good silver coins, but they didn't get rid of the terrible stuff. Elizabeth came in and got rid of all the bad money.
Yeah.
So Civil War hoards, the oldest coin will often be an Edward VI or a Mary coin.
Yeah. I mean, it seems quite extraordinary to us today, I think, to imagine that people were still using coins that were 100 years old and they were still,
Yes, you're too
they were
young.
still
You're
currency.
too young. I can remember Edward VII coins when I was young, with pre-decimalisation.
Yeah.
The coins didn't change. And you don't withdraw the coins because the ruler died, you keep them there.
So, who else have we got?
James I. There are some coins that have dates on, but most coins of this period do not have dates on. Oh. But the mint organised its production by putting a little mark on, so we can date those.
And then finally...
Charles, this is a nice shilling of Charles. He's telling us a shilling. It says 12 for 12 pence.
Yeah, so he's the last one.
He's the latest one in the hoard, and the hoard ends with a lot of coins of his from one particular mint mark, which is called triangle and circle, because obviously it's a triangle inside a circle. And that was the mark that was being used between 1641 and 1643.
Right.
And that's really important, because in 1642, the King leaves London, the Civil War starts.
Yeah.
So this is the coin issue being produced as the Civil War is just beginning.
Yeah.
And you get a lot of coin hoards that end at this time, so everyone is hiding their money.
And is there anything else unusual about this? I mean, the scratching out of faces seems to be quite odd. Is that something we often see?
Yes, to a degree. It's not every hoard has got these scratches, but enough of them do for it to be a serious phenomenon of the period.
Yeah.
We don't really understand why they did it. And this hoard is typical in the sense that most of the scratch coins are shillings, and most of the scratch coins are Elizabeth. So if you would imagine if there was a political motive during the Civil War of scratching the King's face out, it's going to be Charles, it's not Elizabeth. Elizabeth was viewed as in a more positive light. She was the comparison against which the Stuarts failed.
Yeah. So what is the explanation for these scratches, then?
I'm inclined to think there is some sort of practical explanation. You might just be keeping track. You might be accounting them. It might be the top one in the pile. It could be something like that. Who knows?
So with a
coin hoard like this, sometimes with earlier coin hoards, we're left wondering whether perhaps they're votive offerings or people burying their wealth at this point.
This is pure hiding your economic wealth and hoping to come back to it.
Yeah.
We're in the point where England is collapsing, disintegrating, and people are hiding their coins, hiding everything they can get and putting it in the ground. And generally speaking, the hoards are found across the country where the two sides are meeting.
Right.
They sort of sweep down into Down Yorkshire and through the Midlands and where the King's headquarters was into the West Country where the two armies are always meeting. They do reflect how the war was working.
They reflect that clash.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of the wealth that was buried here, can you give me an equivalent?
It's £13, 4 shillings and sixpence.
Yeah, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but how much was it then?
But that's very easily an annual salary of a worker.
Yeah. They
used to say that Elizabethan gentlemen should be able to live off £10 a year.
Right.
We're a bit later now, but you know, £13 is a good income for pretty much anyone who wasn't a gentleman or a really rich trader.
Yeah. So in that pot, we've got a small fortune.
Yes, we have somebody's annual wages.
Yeah. And they never came back to retrieve it.
Something happened.
Next, we travel to Coldingham, right at the English-Scottish border, in pursuit of a powerful but forgotten Anglo-Saxon princess. This site lies just across the water from the famous Lindisfarne Abbey. Lindisfarne was founded by King Oswald, who is still famous today for transforming Britain into a Christian country. But the role his sister played has often been overlooked. Rejecting the traditional option of marriage, Princess Ebba became an abbess and played a crucial part in the spread of this religion. But the precise location of her monastery has proved elusive. A team of archaeologists and volunteers from Dig Ventures is hoping to put Ebba back into the story of how Christianity spread.
So hold something on this side. Yeah.
So we're here at Coldingham looking for St Ebba's Monastery, an Anglo-Saxon double monastery that we think was somewhere around the location.
The abbey that Ebba established would have acted as a vital link between the evangelical monks of Lindisfarne and the people on the mainland they needed to reach. The hunt starts near a later Norman priory, often placed on the site of an older abbey. But the remains of these Saxon abbeys are incredibly elusive. There are often no stone buildings to find, so even discovering the site of a chapel can be difficult. But there usually is a marked boundary.
We started to clean back along this trench, and what's really exciting is we started to find some archaeological features. What we think we found is a ditch which is similar to the 7th century ditch found in earlier excavations.
A ditch dating to the 7th century was found in a nearby field 13 years ago. And if this new ditch connects to that one, it could suggest that they're on the very edge of the monastery site. The team have just 12 more days to find solid evidence. But with a good start like this, they're feeling confident.
Might be a tiny bit of tile or something.
But then some surprising material begins to emerge.
Bones coming out of everywhere. This whole layer is full of it.
These are animal bones.
We are halfway through week 2 and we have loads and loads of animal bone, which makes me desperate and happy at the same time. Happy because it's really exciting, but desperate because we only have 4 days to clean it all.
While heaps of animal bones might not be the evidence the team was expecting, it is interesting. The quantity of animal bones suggests that something more than just the consumption of meat was happening here.
We might have a tannery here making leather, glue, tallow for candles. There's all sorts of things they'd have been using animals for.
The bones and the boundary ditch won't reveal their secrets until long after this short dig is over and dating work can be done. But it's a promising start to an archaeological quest to give Ebba the recognition she deserves. Even when women held positions of power and were written about in historical texts, they seem to have been selectively forgotten about. 300 miles south in Essex, another team is uncovering the story of another powerful Anglo-Saxon woman. A new shopping centre is planned for the centre of Barking, giving the team from Thames Valley Archaeological Services a chance to dig. And they're on the trail of another elusive monastery. In Anglo-Saxon Britain, the growth and success of a town was often linked to the presence of an economically powerful abbey. And in Barking, that success built on the work of a princess called Ethelberga, who we know founded the first monastery there. Our next dig is providing tantalising evidence of Saxon occupation, industry and trade, which is probably linked to her abbey. They start digging where some Anglo-Saxon buildings were found back in the 80s, and soon they find something promising.
This is day 12 of our excavation at Barking Abbey. We're looking at a Saxon building. Just this morning I'm discovering that it's starting to look like it's a sunken floored building, like a grub hut perhaps, but maybe a grub hut that's used as a church.
A grub hut is a characteristic Anglo-Saxon building with a sunken floor. So they decide to dig down through this pit, hoping they're on the right track.
I found that.
Oh, nice.
Looks like a rusty old bit of barbed wire, doesn't it? But I'm pretty convinced that that's a copper alloy pin, and it's almost as if that's like a little bird or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe it's something that goes like in a nun's hair or holds a headdress.
So it's a hairpin.
To a hairpin.
This hairpin might be tiny, but it's a potentially prestigious item that could have been worn by a wealthy Anglo-Saxon woman. Then later that day, Graham's expert eye spots something else.
Oh, wow. Just found a little piece of Saxon period glass coming out of the building that we're calling the chapel. And that's probably from the 8th century.
Wow.
Which is exciting.
Yeah.
Archaeologists getting excited about tiny little bits of glass stuff.
There's every reason to be excited. In Anglo-Saxon Britain, glass was a rare luxury. And perhaps not so unexpected here if there was a monastery on this site. The team settle in to comb every inch of this sunken feature because the tiniest piece of evidence could make all the difference. But that afternoon, they find something that tells them far more than they'd ever expected.
We found a piece of Millefiori rod that was on top of a burnt layer.
Oh, that is gorgeous. It really is.
These rods are essentially offcuts from making fine glassware. So this could be powerful evidence that there is a rare Anglo-Saxon glass factory on this site.
We've got evidence of consumption of glassware in the form of glass vessels, but we're now starting to get evidence of production of glasswork in the Saxon period. There's probably less than 5 Saxon period glass production sites in Britain. So to find that really is very exciting.
These finds give us tantalising glimpses of Anglo-Saxon life, but do they confirm the presence of an abbey? The new site director, Kyle, explains more in the lab. We saw some film of uncovering a grub hut, a kind of sunken floored building. Do you think was it a chapel?
Unfortunately, when we got to the bottom of this supposed sunken feature building, we found some plastic lining. So it turned out that this was backfill.
How frustrating.
It was very frustrating.
Because you do all that digging, thinking you're digging into pristine, stratified layers, and then you get down and find out that it's been disturbed.
Yeah, so we found quite a few nice finds in it as well, which suggested at least these soils were part of the monastery.
So what have we got here?
So here we've got the bird head pin.
Oh, yeah.
So this is quite a high status object. And this here we think is the top of an incense burner. So that kind of ties into the idea that there was sort of a religious ceremony going on.
But I think that, for me, one of the things that really caught my eye and seems quite important is that, which is just a bit of leftover glass from making glass, but it's the fact that they were making glass that's
that's so interesting.
Yeah, no, there's definitely evidence to point towards them making glass in the area, and we know that there was supposedly a glassworking facility around the abbey, but unfortunately we didn't actually find the structure that we're hoping to find.
You know, tantalising glimpses, artefacts that definitely date to the right time period, but as yet Barking Abbey remains a bit elusive. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
So they have the right finds at Barking, but no monastery. At Coldingham, it's the opposite. Few finds, but possibly a monastery boundary. I've asked Manda Forster into the lab to explain her findings.
So is this your plan from this year?
Yes, so
can you
these are
talk me through it? It's quite complicated.
What we're focusing on here, really, in terms of our Anglo-Saxon monastery and looking for Ebba, is this feature here that comes through.
So you think that's the ditch?
Yeah, that is the ditch. And hopefully we'll prove it later. But if you imagine zooming out, where I'm standing, I'm pretty much in the priory grounds.
Yeah. And this is the perimeter.
And this is the perimeter. It's if we could establish that what we do have here is the Valum ditch, and we can start to pull together some more of the evidence that we've seen. If we've got the dates in the right places and we've got small artefacts, these really start to point towards this as being the monastic community for Ebba's site.
And actually, it's the ditch that's
ditch,
more interesting.
The small ditch that was really quietly empty, but with environmental deposits. And that's the thing. I mean, what you don't always get on an archaeological site is tons of material culture, loads of finds that really point to things, and lots of shiny stuff. I mean, sometimes you do just find soil and cuts and features.
Yeah. And how important do you think this monastery and Ebba herself was to the spread of Christianity through
in this
Britain?
area?
Yeah.
She was brought up in a family with 7 brothers, 3 of which were then kings. They set up between them monasteries all over Northumbria. These were real power centres. You know, she was a powerful woman with a large part of an economy around her.
It's fascinating how involved women were in powerful positions in the early Anglo-Saxon church, I think.
It's kind of moment in history where some women were able to really have that kind of equal power with men as well.
Yeah. And I think that's something that disappears later.
Yeah, certainly by the establishment of the Norman religious communities, women can no longer go into the shrine of St Cuthbert, which was around the Norman time.
Yeah.
So within a really short space of time, you've got women that are powerful enough to be able to set up monastic communities and to lead and to have this kind of really strong economic position in a society. And then within a couple of 100 years, they can't go into a shrine anymore.
In Anglo-Saxon England, women pretty much had 2 choices: marriage or the church, something that could create a bit of an identity crisis.
One of the tiniest objects in the Norwich Castle Museum reveals this story.
This is a metal detector find that was made in 1998. It's, I think, one of the most remarkable things that we've had brought in through metal detecting in the last 20 years.
What is it?
It's a seal matrix. In other words, the thing that was used to make the impression that makes a seal.
Yeah.
And this was actually within a ring, a gold finger ring, and it would have spun on the gold rod that runs through the centre of it.
So I can just about spot that gold rod there, and it's got a name on it.
It says Baldahildis, or Baltild, which is a female name.
And do we have any idea who this woman is?
We've got one historical figure called Baltild, an Anglo-Saxon sold into slavery and bought by the mayor of the court in 7th century France. And she then becomes queen, and ultimately she takes on the role of regent, and she rules the kingdom in her own right.
So this historical Baltilda, I mean, she's a really good candidate for the person that would have had an object like this. This is high status. It implies that somebody is literate.
Absolutely, it ticks all of the right boxes.
So why is it on a rod?
It's on a rod so that it actually rotates on that. So you have the public side with her name on it, but if you rotate it, you can see a couple in an intimate embrace beneath a cross.
OK, I wasn't expecting that. But no, it's actually quite rude. I mean, I can see genitals.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it could be an arm coming out very low down on the body, but I don't think it is.
I'm an anatomist, and I think I know what I'm looking at here.
It is a remarkable thing.
But combined with a cross, this seems to be a very peculiar image.
It might suggest something like a betrothal ring. And in this particular case, if she goes into a nunnery, maybe she's therefore a bride of Christ, and that's why she's beneath the cross.
It's quite curious because I think in a single object it almost encapsulates the choices that were there for high-status Anglo-Saxon women. You're either a wife and a mother or you're a nun, and it combines those double identities.
It does, and it also speaks of the power of these early women as well. I mean, Baltild is somebody that founds a monastery at Shell, and when she loses political power, sure enough, she's obliged to go into Shell as a nun herself in about 665. And there she remains until she dies in about 680. And then 11 years later, she's pronounced a saint.
Archaeology can reveal entirely new information about our ancestors, as well as giving us a tangible link to people whose stories have been largely forgotten. Getting closer to the physical reality of the monasteries these women founded will hopefully put them back in the picture. This programme has shown how every new excavation forces us to re-evaluate the story of Britain. From discovering how Stone Age people were more prolific monument builders than we ever realised.
That makes it an almost magical experience. The water will be rushing down on either side like a large prehistoric water feature.
To the treatment of slaves after death under Roman rule. And the astounding bravery of the men facing the worst horrors of the First World War. Through archaeology, we are able to reach back and touch their lives. "2,000 years ago, Iron Age Britain was on the very edge of the known world. We've been told it was a wild and inhospitable place, untouched by civilization.
Our Iron Age ancestors were primitive, warlike, hard drinking, and they practiced strange, barbaric customs like headhunting. Now, this is not a picture painted by our ancestors themselves. They left us no written records. Instead, it is the description we get from the people who came to conquer them, the Romans, and it looms large in our imaginations.
But now archaeologists are challenging that view of life in Britain before the Romans.
We suppose it's always the Romans who invent these things, but there it is.
And their dig diaries are capturing for us all their extraordinary finds. We discover that Iron Age hill forts might not be forts at all. We dive into a loch's cold waters to reveal the impressive skills of Iron Age builders.
Oh my gosh, wow, how exciting is that?
And at the heart of this Digging for Britain special, we get exclusive access to a newly discovered and truly spectacular grave.
It sheds light on everything from our Iron Age ancestors' engineering prowess to their spiritual beliefs to how they like to stage a celebration.
I'll be in the lab where archaeologists will bring in everything from metalwork to human remains. And archaeologist Raksha Dave will use the latest scientific techniques to examine these finds and unlock the secrets of pre-Roman Britain.
This is absolutely extraordinary.
This is helping us to tell a very different story of life in the Iron Age. Welcome to Digging for Britain.
For this special programme, I've come to the Museum of London. It's a fitting place to explore the real legacy of our Iron Age ancestors.
The Romans founded London, or Londinium, and this wall marks the boundary of their new city. It was from here that they set out to tame the British savages, to bring them firmly under the imperial yoke. But did the ancient Britons really need civilising?
Our lead investigation takes us north to the small town of Pocklington on the edge of the Yorkshire Wolds. In 2014, archaeologists working at Burnby Lane, the site of a new housing development, unearthed a remarkable find.
Very exciting. 3 barrows now.
They found a series of Iron Age burial mounds known as square barrows.
That's six burials in this one barrow alone.
We came here 8 months ago, anticipating a couple of square barrows, but in fact we've actually got an Iron Age cemetery. We've excavated over 60 barrows and 101 skeletons to date.
The team have since recovered a further 70 skeletons, making this one of the largest Iron Age cemeteries ever discovered in Britain.
Oh, looking good. Extremely good.
But in the spring of 2018, a mile down the road, the team made an even more sensational discovery.
These are the 2 wheels standing upright. They'll probably extend another 90 centimetres into the ground.
It's the first sign of a chariot burial.
Usually they're totally dismantled, the wheels are laid flat, all components are taken apart and laid within the grave. This one is as if it's up and ready to go, really.
This is only the 3rd fully assembled chariot burial found in Britain. A chariot was the Iron Age equivalent of a sports car and a tank at the same time, and the team have just uncovered its driver.
The chariot also has a passenger compartment, rectangular stain of darker soil, and within the passenger compartment, Martin's cleaning up the human burial.
But the discovery of 2 animal skeletons transforms this already unusual burial into something completely unprecedented.
What makes this one special is the chariot attached to these 2 ponies. To have a chariot with horse burials is almost unheard of.
You can see at the front here, we actually have the leg of the horse going down vertical. This is the only example we know of in the UK that has upright horses.
Archaeologists have never discovered such a complete chariot burial as this.
It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and what we can see here is one of the most dramatic burials we know of from this area in the Iron Age.
For us, this is the most significant chariot that we've excavated, and it's changing our outlook and perception of the Iron Age.
This chariot burial is one of the most exciting Iron Age discoveries ever found in Britain. I've invited site director Paula Ware and Iron Age expert Melanie Giles into the studio to find out what the contents of this burial reveal about life in the Iron Age. Paula, this really is an incredible find. I've never seen anything like it.
I know, we were really surprised. 2 upright ponies, chariot, and a skeleton, just amazing.
And the poor ponies have lost their heads. They would have once been up in the barrow, and that's been sheared off by the plough millennium ago, probably. But your average Iron Age burial is very simple, often no grave goods at all. And where you do get them in that Burnby Lane site, they're delicate and they're nice, but they're quite simple. Little bow brooches with a little foot that would have had some decoration on it, a little red glass bead on this tiny one here, and occasionally some very exquisite little glass beads, like this one. This one has a lovely kind of spiral design on it. But they're low-key, so when we see something like this, it really is stand out.
Now, how have they got the ponies into that grave in that position?
From what we can tell, they're an old pair of ponies. They're a tried and tested team, and maybe they trust their owners and, you know, go into the pit. And so I would guess that they're actually encouraged to take that jump down into the grave pit, and then you get the chariot in, harness them up, and slit their throats as you backfill rapidly around them.
Because if you were to get the pony in and then kill the pony, it would fall over.
Yes.
They have not fallen over.
No.
So they must have been piling the soil back in and round.
I don't think you could have killed
those
2
bodies
ponies unless you did it simultaneously.
Yeah.
They wouldn't stay in position.
And I think seeing this excavation, you are tapping into what an incredible spectacle that funeral must have been.
We think that a lot of people have gathered around to view this body around the graveside. This is a moment that sticks in their memory, and they didn't write records, but presumably they did sing songs and tell stories. And in one sense, we're the last witnesses to that drama, that spectacle of the funeral, which really is, for my money, probably the most spectacular burial I've seen in Iron Age Britain.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is you look at a grave like this and you see just how sophisticated it is. And this is not the picture of the Iron Age Britons that the Romans give us. I mean, they paint the Iron Age Britons as uncivilised barbarians.
Yes, but they're seeing them from the outside and they're trying to conquer them. So they're going to exaggerate those features that they find barbaric or strange. They're going to make them sound like very worthy enemies. And it's only in unpicking both the bodies of the ponies, the bodies of the individual, the finds, the crafting behind it, and the drama, the spectacle, that we'll fully understand his story.
Over the course of this programme, we'll follow the team as they discover what this burial can tell us about our Iron Age ancestors. Of the 25 chariot burials found in Britain, 23 have been in East Yorkshire. It looks like the signature of a single tribe. The landscape of Iron Age Britain, divided up amongst tribes, was culturally diverse. But another culture was advancing across Europe as the Roman Empire expanded. Wherever they went, they took with them a common language and a unified culture. So for the Romans, the rich and varied tribal culture of the ancient Britons represented not just a challenge, but a threat. And none of the tribes in Iron Age Britain posed more of a threat to Roman rule than the tribes who lived in modern-day Scotland. Roman authors dismissed them as a disorganised rabble. But new archaeological evidence from our second site at Loch Tay in Perthshire is challenging that description. Loch Tay was home to 18 prehistoric buildings called crannogs. They were houses that looked like this reconstruction and were built on the loch bed itself. There are over 500 crannogs in Scotland, and they're amongst the most famous prehistoric features in the landscape. They are impressive pieces of engineering. No one could work out if Loch Tay's crannogs were built one by one over many centuries, or at the same time to form a village. But now a team of archaeologists from the Living on Water project are trying to find out.
If they're occupied at the same time, the timber, labor, and other resources required to build one of these sites, and indeed to then occupy it, is really quite a vast amount and a real large investment.
This would be evidence of an organised community capable of extraordinary feats of construction. But to discover if this was the case, the team needs to excavate the remains of the crannogs.
So we're at Fernan Crannog, and 2,500 years ago in this spot would have been a crannog. Crannogs are artificial island dwellings, usually built of timber and stone, on top of which sat a timber roundhouse.
For the past 2 summers, Michael and his team of underwater archaeologists have been searching for timbers at 6 of the loch's crannogs.
So we're quite lucky with Fernan Crannog in that Fernan is so shallow on top that we're actually able to do a lot on snorkel.
The divers spend all day shifting stones to try to get to the Iron Age timbers underneath.
So a lot of our work on this site means picking up stones like this.
As we peel back the rubble, around the base of the crannog was one very well-preserved timber that had a mortise hole cut through it, used to join it to another timber. And that's a fantastic constructional detail.
And this remarkable insight into Iron Age carpentry is only possible because the mud of the loch bed is devoid of oxygen. So these ancient timbers are in pristine condition.
The timbers are 2,500 years old, and they look like fresh-cut timber until they come out into the atmosphere, and then they usually relatively quickly turn black.
So the object really is to sample as many timbers as we can. We then take these timbers back to the lab to see if they all were perhaps cut down at the same time.
Archaeologists can usually employ two methods to date wood: tree ring dating or dendrochronology, and radiocarbon dating. Unfortunately, tree ring dating doesn't work well for Iron Age central Scotland, and radiocarbon dates for this period are notoriously imprecise, providing very wide date ranges.
This period is a real tough spot in terms of what we know about where people were living and how they were living. And that is due to this quirk in how radiocarbon dating works over the period 800 to 400 BC.
So the team are applying a method called wiggle match that very precisely maps the levels of radioactive carbon found in the tree rings of this timber to date the cranogs. If they discover that the cranogs were all built around the same time, it will transform our understanding of life on Iron Age Loch Tay. Mike and Derek are joining me in the studio to reveal their results.
We have some of these artifacts from Oakbank Crannog, just
This is on Loch Tay.
And this is on Loch Tay, that's
Yeah.
right. And this is one of those timbers that seems to suggest something within the domestic structure that would have sat on top of the crannog. And we can see that from the mortise at the end there, the partial mortise. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
As well as the dowling.
These here?
Yes, those are the dowels there. And what's interesting about the dowels is that they've been hand-carved, probably with a knife, so we can actually see the tool marks at the edge of the dowel.
I mean, this is sophisticated woodworking.
This whole community are master craftsmen, master carpenters. They're using almost exclusively oak and alder. Oak is, of course, very strong. Alder, when it's waterlogged, it maintains its structural integrity better than just about any other kind of wood species. And that sort of just speaks to their mastery of carpentry and understanding of forest resources.
So we've got these big timbers which are all about the construction of the buildings themselves, but then also wooden artefacts being preserved, which is lovely. I love this.
Yes.
What is it?
That's a butter dish.
How do you know it's a butter dish?
Lipid analysis from material on the inside of it.
Some kind of solid dairy product.
Yes, high fat content.
So is this it? That's it. That is Iron Age butter.
Yeah, yeah. There's a question mark at
Or
the end
cheese.
of that. But yes.
Yeah, and it's fromage free. What about these other artifacts then? Is that a spindle whorl?
Yes. So we've got spindle whorl, we've got a knife.
Yeah.
We've got a whistle over here, a nice little small whistle. And this is a bit of textile.
Oh, wow. I mean, this fabric's just beautiful, isn't it? The weaving of that.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
It gives us a tiny little insight into what they had in their homes, what they might have been wearing, that sort of thing, which is so elusive in archaeology.
That's a nice little chunk.
So how precise can you now be about the dates of these cranogs?
Using the dendrochronology as well as radiocarbon wiggle matching, we're starting to see that cranogs are being constructed at the same time, pretty much bang in the middle of the first millennium BC. So it's actually changed things quite a bit.
Yeah. So you may be looking at a real kind of clustering of cranog building over a century to a century and a half.
Yeah, I mean, it's looking like it's a community that's actually living on the water.
What comes along with that, particularly when we consider just how much material is required to build a cranog, is that there is a very sophisticated understanding of how to manage a woodland and how to maintain that resource so that you can continue to occupy cranog, build a new one, and maintain the ones that you have already constructed.
So I think the burning question is why were they doing this? I mean, it seems a lot of effort to go to build a house out on a loch rather than just building it on the land.
The traditional interpretation has always been defense or protection. And I think that it perhaps overstates the level of violence that we have evidence for in the early Iron Age. But of course, we are really left with a big question mark of why people feel the need to build these things when they are such an enormous investment of labor and resources.
So we still don't really know why they're building cranogs, but at this point in time, we are definitely looking at quite large communities coming together, certainly more than one cranog operating at the same time, and evidence of master carpentry.
Yeah, definitely. That's a story that's taking shape right now.
The Loch Tay excavations provide a counterpoint to that Roman suggestion of a backwards people in ancient Scotland. Instead, we're seeing a community of skilled craftspeople who could deliver well-organised and ambitious projects. And in East Yorkshire, even more evidence is starting to emerge of sophisticated Iron Age engineering.
What I'm doing now is trying to identify any spokes that may still survive in the wheel. You might just about see the shadow of one there. And then a triangular area here, which is between two spokes running like that. And darker brown soil here is where the wooden wheel rim was.
Whilst the chariot's wooden structure has rotted away, its iron tyres are still well preserved. And gradually the team is finding more and more pieces of Iron Age metalwork.
But it's a pretty thick, functional piece of iron, that. And then this small ring attached to the side of it, what that does is lock the whole wheel together. It fixes the hub to the axle, which is sticking through the end there. Otherwise your wheel might fly off as you're rolling along. The end of the hub is protected by this thin bronze band. It's got this decorative rib running along the centre. It would look special, wouldn't it, on the outside of the wheel?
By week 10, the tyres are ready for lifting, and it's conservator Mag Felter's job to get them out without breaking them.
So today we're dealing with the western wheel. The plan is to get the wheel supported as far as possible with plaster of Paris bandages. You can see I've already started here.
The iron tyres are over 2,000 years old and extremely delicate. One wrong move and they could easily shatter into pieces.
You could probably do with an extra pair of hands just to hold it, just to grab the top.
Yeah, don't matter.
Well done. You want a break?
Yeah, I think
Or behind me, perhaps? Good work, guys. Really nice. Well done.
The wheels were forged as continuous rings of iron, evidence of consummate metalworking skill.
We're going that way round. Nice work, guys. Well done.
Excavations of sites like Pocklington have allowed experts to reconstruct ancient British chariots. To find out more about how these vehicles were made, I've invited chariot builder Robert Herford and archaeologist Peter Hulken into the studio.
Robert, this is a wonderful little model of an Iron Age chariot that you've made here, and I think it's fascinating to look at how it's put together. Are you going to demonstrate how you attach the yoke onto the pole here?
Well, yes. They must have used, as the ancient Egyptians, they must have used rawhide. It has this lovely way of when you've put it on and left it to dry, it becomes like that.
Yeah.
And it shrunk a little bit.
And it shrinks a bit, yeah.
Yes, and it's stiff. And
Go on then, you're going to tie that on.
I'll try.
And then we've got other joints here. What's that?
That is a British linchpin.
So this is the linchpin just here. So this is like once you undo that thong, that's quite a neat, quick-release mechanism to take the wheel off the axle. And it's an amazing bit of metalwork, isn't it, Peter?
Well, this thing is quite extraordinary because what you're looking at is the ability to use two kinds of metals together.
Yeah, I mean, the bronze is unnecessary, really, isn't it? The iron will do the job.
This is demonstrating real showing off. This is the bling of the Iron Age, if you like. But the iron alone, if you look behind you and look at the tyre, to make the iron for one of these vehicles takes about 300 person days. And burying one of these things would be the equivalent today of somebody burying their Mercedes. So these are really a demonstration of the power and prestige of these people buried with these vehicles.
Have you finished tying this
on? Well, I'm getting to a point where when this lot's shrunk a bit and gone hard, it will be a nice stiff joint, that.
You get a great strong but flexible joint then between the yoke and the pole here. So it's better than a bolt, really, isn't it?
Yes, it's certainly a lot better than a bolt.
So, Peter, do you think that Iron Age people were using vehicles like this to move around the landscape?
We know they were, because what aerial archaeology has shown is that people move from community to community along trackways like this. And one trackway in a settlement not that far away, up on the Wolds, we've actually got the ruts here and here surviving, and they are about the same width across the axle as the chariots would have been.
So they've been created by chariot wheels?
We know, and the evidence is here quite clearly in front of us, that they were using it to drive carts or chariots along.
So what do you think this was used for? I mean, is it effectively a road across the landscape?
These were quite well engineered because you're on the chalk.
Yeah.
So they were very clever, take off the topsoil, and they've got a surface.
So you think they are stripping away the topsoil then? So they're doing something. They're not just driving things up and down. I mean, this is extraordinary because I think that we just tend to assume that it was the Romans that brought us roads, and that, you know, before then our ancestors were just kind of roaming willy-nilly all over the landscape. And this is a feat of engineering.
Yeah, and what is quite incredible is there are hundreds of these interconnecting communities in the Iron Age. It was not a kind of woodland of wild people. It was organised, and we've got, quite amazingly, quite near the Pocklington chariot, this trackway, really quite close to where the burial was. So the archaeological evidence suggests that this is actually contemporary with that burial. So bizarrely, we may have the very trackway that chariot made its last journey on with the horses before that quite spectacular burial ritual.
The ancient lanes crisscrossing the Yorkshire wolds make us question that old assumption that the Romans were the first to introduce roads to Britain. These lanes are evidence that this area was already home to a well-connected society well before the Roman invasion. But how far did these people travel? To find out, archaeologist Raksha Dave is joining Richard Madgwick, an archaeological scientist from Cardiff University.
We've got rather a large array of human remains here.
We do. So these are from a range of different sites across Iron Age Somerset. So some of these remains were excavated over 150 years ago and have been subject to very little research at all since their original excavation. So they're really a gold mine in terms of opportunities for reanalysis.
So what is it that you're trying to find out?
Well, I'm particularly interested in knowing where these individuals came from. So every time any human consumes food and drink, chemical signals from those foodstuffs are transferred into the body and become locked in the bones and the teeth. Teeth provide us with a wealth of information about early life origins, because once your teeth develop when you're a child, they don't remodel thereafter. If we can just take a small amount of dental enamel, we get a snapshot, a chemical signal relating to where the people were during their early life. So I'm particularly interested to see whether these people were born and raised in Somerset or whether they've come from elsewhere.
Richard's analysis of these Somerset teeth is one of archaeology's first attempts to sketch the geographical origins of Iron Age Britons. This is the grand reveal. These are your results of what you have so far.
Yeah, these are our first results from the humans from Iron Age Somerset. And you can see most of the data clusters around the middle portion of the graph, and we'd assume that the vast majority of those people are local to the West Country or to southern Britain, but we do have some very clear outliers here.
What are those two doing up there?
Their oxygen values are markedly higher than the rest of the data set, and I think there's a very, very strong chance that they are not from Britain at all. And even these three individuals here sit outside of 95% of all humans that have been analysed from Britain of any period. So they really, really are quite exceptional.
That's extraordinary. So where do you think that these individuals are from?
It's difficult to pinpoint it, but the Mediterranean is an option. Northern Iberia is a possibility as well. It's really transforming our understanding of Iron Age society in the West Country. I've only analysed 38 individuals, and it looks like 5 of them, which is quite a high percentage really, were not raised in Britain. So it's suggesting that it was much, much more diverse than we would have thought.
Richard's research is groundbreaking and, combined with the Yorkshire trackways, suggests that people could travel long distances in pre-Roman Britain.
Back at the Pocklington chariot burial, archaeologists are hoping to find out more about the identity of the chariot rider.
We're pretty sure it's a male now. We also know he's quite a tall individual. I mean, he's about 5'8". The plan next is to actually remove the bones. So the pelvis will come out, the skull will come out, and then it's just a case of how long it takes to free it. There we go.
Oh gosh. Wow, nice edge there. Yeah, great.
With the skeleton removed from the grave, the team can see a hint of a metal object beneath.
Yeah, it's maybe this.
So we've got a nice big oval. It's a flat, very thin plate of some kind.
As they excavate further, they find something very special.
It has that kind of rim lip on the edge, so it's kind of a rim around the edge. So there's this shield that was found at Arras, which is very, very similar.
Martin's hunch is right. The dead man's body was laid on top of a bronze shield.
It looks like it's an edge piece.
Wow.
This will give us the width of the wood that the shield is made from. This is quite fantastic. How exciting is that? You've got the boss of the shield dipping down. You can see the edge of it here. We would have a wooden part of the shield in this area fastened in place with rivets here. We have quite a complex structure. You can see a plate here, and then you've got a sort of outer circle as well in this area.
They don't find a sword or any other weapon in the grave. But could this shield be evidence of a powerful warrior, a figure to match Rome's stereotype of a war-mad Briton?
I think it's quite moving that this is the remains of this man that was buried with such pomp. Yeah, it is, isn't it?
It is, it really is.
Yeah. So he looks old. I mean, these are not the bones of a young man.
He's got a lot of wear and tear to the body, very few teeth left.
This is a man when he smiled. There were no teeth there.
Yes. So he's quite a characterful figure, I would say.
And his fingers are interesting. So where the ligaments attach that keep your tendons in place, we've got all this extra bone growth. There's a ridge of bone on each side. And it's very tempting, isn't it, to say, well, he is a charioteer.
It's rain work.
All of that rain work. And do you think he would have been seen as a warrior? I mean, is a chariot an emblem of a warrior?
I think the chariot is so much more than a weapon. It can be a weapon, but it's a weapon usually, even the Roman authors tell us, of intimidation. But it's also a stage for oration. It's a very dramatic way of arriving in a village if there's a dispute, to command people or persuade them, perhaps, that they should resolve their differences. So he might be seen as quite a powerful peace figure, you know, who's somebody who's able to mediate in disputes. But the shield does speak of that martial culture, but the shield, I think, is there to remind us that his time for being a warrior is over.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. He's a defender of his community, and if need be, he can use all his power and his connections to intimidate people, but his main strength lies in being able to defend his own.
There's a lot of wear and tear. There are injuries. But there's nothing that's obviously a weapon injury here.
No, there's nothing to say that there's a blunt force trauma injury.
We know amongst these communities there are lower rates of sharp force, penetrating violence from blades like swords or axes compared with many other regions in Britain. And that, to me, is a puzzle, because on the surface of it, you look at the chariots, the swords, the shields, they look like the most martially obsessed group in Britain, and yet violence is lower. And I can't help but think that's because actually they're quite successful at doing a lot of posturing, swaggering, bravado, but that is quite effective at keeping the actual bloodshed at a lower level.
The archaeologists lift the shield ready for conservation.
3, 2, 1.
But with no signs of violence on the skeleton, or evidence for an especially violent community, was this shield more than simply a weapon of war?
One of the biggest traps that we can fall into in archaeology is assuming that a particular artefact has a simple, single explanation. A spear is for sticking in someone, a shield is just for protection in battle.
To find out more about the hidden meanings carried by Iron Age shields, I'm taking a look at one of the most beautiful examples found in Britain.
Jackie, this is a replica of one of our most iconic British Iron Age objects. It's a Battersea shield. It's beautiful.
It's exquisite, isn't it? And being a replica, the lovely thing is that we can actually get very up close to it. It's the front portion of a shield. So the shield itself would probably have been of wood. And then we have these 3 circular panels with this very typical kind of sinuous designs.
It is beautiful. Wow.
And then we also have these 27 red glass paste roundels, each with a sort of swastika in metal. We talk about it being deposited in the river near Battersea, and that's where it was found in the Thames in 1857.
We're left wondering why something ends up in the river, because it must be an incredibly high-status object. There's a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of metal has gone into this.
I think generally, because it's such a prestigious item, it's undoubtedly symbolic of power, of wealth. Is it used in warfare? We don't think it's seen much use. It's in very good condition, and therefore we have to see it as having a kind of a symbolic reason for it going into the river.
Yeah.
And the river would have been a very special place. It's a frontier. It's a major life force for the people living in this area at that time. So is it a votive offering, which is symbolising the power of those that were alive, that owned it?
So if it's a votive offering, that suggests that you're getting rid of a lot of wealth, demonstrating that you can do that somehow without losing power and status.
It's conspicuous consumption in a way, isn't it? It is, you know, you are discarding something that is so highly valued, and this would have been a real treasure to those people. It would have been a real one-off as well.
Many pieces of Iron Age metalwork, such as swords and shields, have been found in watery places like rivers and bogs. They're clearly not just functioning as weapons, but imbued with heavy symbolism. And our next dig at the early Iron Age hill fort of Peniclothii in Flintshire is uncovering more evidence that the Roman image of violent British barbarians was way off the mark.
Hill forts are monumental feats of building, and given the Romans' depiction of ancient Britons as warlike savages, it's not surprising that hill forts have often been interpreted as military strongholds. But now some archaeologists are taking a closer look, and they're discovering a different and actually much more interesting story.
Peniclothii Hill Fort is huge, enclosing 19 hectares of Welsh heathland, 440 metres above sea level.
On a clear day, you can actually pick out Blackpool Tower, and on a really clear day, you can see the hills of Cumbria. So it's just stunning.
Rachel Pope is leading a team of students from Liverpool University as they excavate a cross-section through Peniclothii's stone ramparts to try to understand how the hill fort was built and what it was used for.
This one, yeah, it's definitely above that one. Okay, so we're now deconstructing the rampart.
Immediately beneath the grass bank lies a 2-metre-high rampart of earth and stone.
And we have come across this wonderful brown clay.
It's surprising evidence that this Iron Age stonework is more advanced than previously thought.
See this? It's dried now, but when it's wet, this is a very sticky clay. And we've got a band of it running along here. So this is our early Iron Age bonding material, so they're actually using clay to cement these structural blocks together. And I don't think we really understood that Iron Age architecture employed that sort of agent in construction. I suppose that it's always the Romans who invent these things, but there it is.
The 2-metre-high rampart extends for at least 2 kilometres around the hilltop. It's not surprising that hill forts have long been viewed as defensive strongholds. But in week 2, the students discover evidence of an earlier, much smaller structure that challenges this interpretation.
So this is the phase 1 construction here. So it looks like, with careful excavation, we've actually found the earliest phase of construction of the hill fort.
Compared with the later rampart, this original construction was much smaller, only 90 centimetres high. Not much use for defence.
When you're excavating them, what you realise is that they're walls. It would have been a walled enclosure.
This low wall opens up the question of why Penaclothiae was really built. Rachel and her team keep digging to try to find more clues.
OK, so at the start of this season, this whole area was filled by a very meaty early Iron Age rampart built in stone, and as you can see, we've successfully excavated it back to natural. The only feature that isn't natural now is this stone here. It was actually chocked into position, we think, with some of these stones around it. So we're assuming this is to do with marking out, laying out the position of the build. So this is the very first event as it's happening. They're marking out around where they want to build the rampart right at the very start of the process.
The team has excavated what they think are the earliest remains of the hill fort.
This isn't something that's thrown up. This is a long-term, probably intergenerational construction project.
But actually, these foundation stones are not the earliest structure here.
Oh my God! We've got at the very base of the rampart now some horizontal timbers. This is really gorgeous archaeology.
These are the carbonised remains of a hazel fence that dates back 3,000 years to the late Bronze Age. This formed an earlier enclosure at the summit of Penaclothiae.
It's pretty cool. It's a burnt timber palisade, and in it we have a series of 5 burnt stumps, and the best one is there.
The hazel fence and the diminutive height of the early walls call into question whether Penaclothiae was actually a fort at all.
We're probably not looking at enormous numbers of people living in this hill fort, really. We know they're not up here all year round because, to be honest, it's quite nippy on this August day. It's not a permanent sort of township, if you like. So we think they're actually coming from quite some considerable distance to occupy these seasonally in the summer months.
I've invited Rachel into the studio to discuss her findings and how they might challenge that Roman depiction of British violence and aggression.
Rachel, I think what's amazing is that you see those big earthwork ramparts that people are quite familiar with when you look up and see a hill fort. But I don't think you imagine that actually what that is a big stone wall that's kind of got grassed over time.
Yeah, absolutely. But part of the struggle that we've had with interpreting these sites is that isn't really representative of how it was in the past. Right before the hill fort's built, there's a palisaded enclosure on the site here that we've now got samples from. So I've brought along some of the actual carbonised fence from the palisaded enclosure. It's burnt down. It's remarkable survival, really. You tend not to get this. So, you know, it's a bit of a find, really. And it's only after that phase has gone out of use that we see construction of the hill fort as we understand it.
Yeah.
And, you know, the fact that we're finding these new little details, the fact that we've got this sort of the bonding material, it's quite civilised. It's all very clever.
That bonding material I found fascinating. But have we come across that before in Iron Age architecture?
I think we may have done, but we've not understood that it was potentially prehistoric. So when we talked to hill fort experts, it was said, no, this, you know, there's no such thing as this. And then we found it absolutely keyed into the structure of the wall itself. So we know that it's Iron Age.
So, just trying to really get to grips with what they're about. It looks like a fort. It's got a big wall on it. Isn't this just an Iron Age castle?
Right from the get-go, we actually thought that hill forts were Roman. In fact, hill forts are actually largely out of use by the time we've got the Roman conquest. But we start using Roman terminology, so we start calling them hill forts. We're talking about them as military architecture.
Yeah.
But we don't have a lot of evidence for weaponry or, you know, dead bodies. At this phase 1 here, this wall is only about 90 centimetres high. So it's only up. It's not even up to my hip. The evidence that we've got, the archaeology, is suggesting that this seems to be structured around agriculture. So the 19 hectares of Penaclodii, it's about herds, and it's about livestock, and it's about moving people probably from quite some distance and bringing them together to trade their sheep with each other or to share ideas and exchange things and, you know, start to build society.
Penaclodii's walls grew larger and larger across the generations, and even though the hill fort's use may have changed over time, Rachel doesn't believe that it was built for defence.
We've talked about the Iron Age and held it up as the opposite of Roman civilization. And we've always couched it in terms of the barbarians versus the civilized Romans. And actually, I think the people of Britain were actually remarkably civilized before Rome.
Back at the Museum of Somerset, archaeological scientist Richard Madwick is working on Iron Age bones retrieved from hill forts and settlements in southwest England. The bones were found dumped in pits and ditches, which some have claimed as evidence for Iron Age savagery. But Richard's work is increasingly challenging that view.
We do have an awful lot of remains that have been excavated from Iron Age Somerset, but as you can see, we don't have many whole bodies.
And why is that?
Well, this is a big debate. A lot of people have suggested for a long time that they were exposed to the elements, to scavengers, to agents like weathering, and therefore they became defleshed, disarticulated, and eventually became perhaps sort of unceremoniously deposited in pits and ditches in various Iron Age sites.
Do you think that they've been unceremoniously deposited because they met a violent end?
That's certainly a possibility. That's been suggested by some people, and there's certainly injuries which are consistent with sharp-bladed weapons. But of course, some of them could be the dismembering of the body after death has occurred. Very difficult to tell the difference there. So quite a lot of these theories have become received wisdom rather than based on a large body of evidence.
Richard's developed a technique to find out how these bones were treated after death. The key to his research is to examine thin cross-sections of each bone under the microscope to see whether the bacteria has attacked it.
This is a thin section of a humerus from Glastonbury Lake Village, and we can make out the blood vessels which run through the cells of bone. However, the vast majority of the samples we analysed were really, really poorly preserved, so I've got plenty that I can show you. See, I think without knowing anything about bone histology, you can tell
straight away
that this looks badly preserved, doesn't it?
It's a lot more murkier and muckier, this. You can't actually see any of those really nice holes with the blood vessels that go through.
The microscope reveals clear evidence of bone decay.
When you're buried as a complete individual, the bacteria in the guts migrate around the body and attack at the bone. So this means rather than the remains having been excarnated and exposed, which would mean the flesh would rapidly degrade and the bacteria would die, this individual was buried whole.
Richard's slides tell him that these remains were buried as complete skeletons. So why were they discovered in open pits as many separated bones?
This is the exciting element of the research, really, in that it looks that actually what was happening is these individuals were buried and then later, after a period of at least 6 months, revisited and parts of the body were taken away.
Richard has discovered that these bones weren't just dumped in the ground. The people who moved them clearly placed great value on how they were handled.
Richard, this is absolutely extraordinary. Your work is redefining what we think about the Iron Age and what they do with burials and their practices.
It really is. This is not just unceremonious deposition of the dead in any old pit that might be lying around. And on top of that, people have suggested that perhaps we're getting these disarticulated bodies because the Iron Age was a very violent period. But it doesn't look like the main reason why all these bones are becoming separated from the rest of their bodies is because they're being hacked to pieces. It looks much more like they're being buried, returned to, and then parts taken away.
Richard's work is uncovering practices that may seem strange and macabre to us. But back in Pocklington, archaeologists are finding further evidence that the way they buried their dead was of great importance to Iron Age communities.
All around we have what appears to be parts of animals, mostly pig. So we have a pig jaw and there's more teeth and jaw bones. We have various ribs. The ribs look like they could have been a joint of meat, which indicate that they've placed joints of meat on or around the burial.
A lot of the pig bones seem to be from juveniles. Suckling pig is your nice cut of meat, very sweet tasting meat. But it's also, in a way, a bit of waste of resources to consume your animals young. These haven't been fattened up for a year, which is an indicator that you've got a lot of money or a lot of wealth, and basically you can afford to take the best cuts of meat when you want.
The discovery of a meat hook amongst the pig bones proves a significant find.
Certainly, in a British Iron Age grave, that object has not been found. And it does give a bit of an insight into the way they're cooking and preparing the food.
The excavation is painting a picture of a huge feast accompanying this man's journey into the afterlife. So this is the meat hook with the ribs?
To me, that's one of the most significant things. The fact that they've actually brought it on the meat hook itself. You know, this is hot from the feast. There's a moment of ceremony where somebody brings that and elaborately places it outside the chariot. That's their offering to a man they respect and want to send off with a little bit of a gift from them. There are about 6 pigs represented in the portions of meat that are brought to his graveside. We have a hog roast for a special ceremony like a wedding, and we expect that to feed a large number of guests. So to sacrifice 6 of them tells us about, to me, a massive funeral ceremony. So part of the lavishness of the send-off may be a few people using their connections and their wealth to make a big show of it. That's how their standing is now renegotiated amongst the living.
His death leaves a power vacuum.
It may well have done. And so how many pigs did you bring for the feast? What did you bring to, did you bring that shield? Was it his shield? Was it your shield? Those are all fascinating questions that we must ask when we deal with the burial.
It's such a colourful picture, this idea of an Iron Age funeral with this important man, this leader, this chieftain, lying in his open grave with his chariot and his horses, and the whole community converging to witness this event and feasting together. And right now, conservators at Museum of London Archaeology are working on an astonishing set of finds which demonstrates just how important feasting was to Iron Age society. I'm joining John Thomas, whose team discovered 11 cauldrons near the village of Glenfield, near Leicester, and Liz Barham, who is conserving the cauldrons. I'm hoping their work can tell me more about how feasts bound Iron Age society together. So this is a CT scan of this cauldron.
It is, yeah.
And it's picking up the iron really nicely and showing you details that you can't see here.
Yeah, so you can see the ring handles really clearly and the band that's attached to the rim, all made of iron. And then that's riveted to the copper bowl beneath, but that doesn't show up because the copper is so thin.
It is incredibly thin. I mean, you know, where it's fragmented, you can see just how thin that metal is.
Yes, I mean, in some cases, with cauldrons of this type, the metal is even 1/10 of a millimetre thick in places. So they're terribly skillful in making copper bowls of that thickness. They've averaged out at about 50 litres or so per cauldron.
That's a lot of broth, or whatever it was. I mean, do we know what was in them?
We have found some small pieces of bone in there and also some small charcoal pieces in areas on the surface.
But residues that have been found on similar cauldrons have shown that they've had meat stews in, honey-type mead drinks in them, so alcohol, but, you know, sort of catering on a large scale.
So this is just one of how many cauldrons did you find?
We got 11 complete ones and broken fragments of many others all across the site.
So it's a lot of cauldrons altogether. Why do they need so many cauldrons?
They're thought to be involved in large groups of people coming together certain times of the year, perhaps to celebrate marriages or mourn people have died, or just bringing people together for creating workforces. So, you know, if you needed something like a big roundhouse building, you get your neighbours in and say, build us a roundhouse and we'll give you a good feast afterwards. And that may be what's going on here.
Whether laid on when a crannog was raised or to accompany a spectacular funeral, feasts were the glue that held Iron Age society together.
That's the end of the excavation. Everything's been removed and recorded.
After 11 weeks of excavation, Paula's team of archaeologists have finished unearthing this extraordinary chariot burial. Now, using 3D photography of the skull and the latest modelling techniques, we can paint a portrait of the man it honoured. So we know he was at least in his late 40s, if not a bit older, and you've had a facial reconstruction done. The moment of revelation.
Oh. Well, he's somebody I'd follow.
He looks powerful.
He does, yeah. He is an older individual, you can see that already, that sense of exuding an air of authority. And I think, you know, his burial is set apart in the landscape. He has some fame, some renown, and is somebody who's looked to in all sorts of situations.
The isotope analysis says he's from the locality. Although he's moved around, he originally was on the chalk, which we could interpret as the higher worlds, and then in later life has moved. So, no, we're going with he's a local.
Yeah. We found out more about the community, the society at Pocklington in the Iron Age. How has this contributed to our understanding of Iron Age Britain?
To me, it's valuable because they didn't write records, and so the way in which they're orchestrating this funeral with the ponies pulling the chariot, the drama that happens around this, the placing of the body, the placing of the joints from the feasts, the little grave goods, the degree of craftsmanship that's gone on in the making of the things that go into that grave, the technology of that chariot. That enables us to tell a much richer story of these people than we could ever have gleaned from the classical authors' accounts.
The Romans painted the ancient Britons as barbaric and warlike. But the archaeological digs that we've followed across Britain this year give us a different view. Our digs show us that these so-called savages lived in sophisticated and well-connected communities. The chariot, the 2 ponies, and the stunning bronze shield reveal the achievements of the Iron Age in one spectacular burial. Smart engineering, highly skilled metalwork, and sophisticated beliefs were all brought together to send this figure on his way to the afterlife. These digs are revealing that far from being warlike thugs, the Iron Age Britons didn't need civilizing at all.